Even if you've done something bad, you need to tell the truth about it. If you've done something good, you need to tell the truth about that. If you're proud of yourself, you say, I'm proud of myself. If you're ashamed of yourself, say, I'm ashamed of myself. And you tell them what you did that you're ashamed of, or what you did that you're proud of, or what you did that you don't know about. And you just go along kind of being simple, saying, yes, I would like something to eat. Yes, I want some more candy. And just keep on saying what it is you want. And sometimes you'll get what you want, and sometimes you won't. And when you don't get what you want, say, okay, if it's okay. If it isn't okay, say, well, I still want that, and I'm mad at you for not giving it to me. Now, your parents might wonder, this boy must be growing up, because that's what you do when you grow up. You start having enough courage to tell the truth. You just say, yes, this is what's so. This is what I did, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing now. I don't want to go eat now. I'm busy working on my Legos and building this tower.
What is bad about not being honest?
You're wrapped up in your own mind. You're trapped in your mind. You can't do anything but think about what it is that you haven't told somebody and how you're deceiving them. You keep thinking, okay, now who did I tell what? Oh, Lord, I'm not sure if I told what's his name about this, or I told him something else. What was it? You can't keep track of all the different ways that you modified what you reported to other people. And so you end up thinking, what did I say? What am I going to do? What am I trying to get them to do for me? What is it I'm trying to do to manipulate them? You're all wrapped up in trying to get people conned into doing what you want. And when you're wrapped up in that, you don't actually enjoy it when you get what you want, because you know you just conned them into it. And so the way you can really enjoy getting what you want is you ask for it and they say, yeah, go ahead, you can have it. That's great. Then you can really enjoy it and be happy. But if you con your way into it, you can't enjoy it and be happy. So the idea is being able to be happy and be related to people and not be guarded and careful and protected and afraid of being found out. That's a lousy way to live. It's a better way to live out loud, let the chips fall where they may, have a few hard times now and then, but still they get all cleaned up because everybody tells the truth.
I'm 11, and telling the truth seems really fucking easy. Just have to say what I want.
You're right.
So why doesn't everyone do it? And also it seems like I'm gonna be rich when I'm older. I'm gonna have good relationships. I'm gonna get stuff. Why doesn't everyone do it?
Well, you know how much fun pretend games are? You know how it's fun to play like you're somebody else, or to pretend, or to watch videos and play like you're the character, or when you're playing outside, you're running around playing games and you're pretending like you're king of the hill, or whatever it is you're pretending in that game. Pretending is a lot of fun. Problem is, at about 11 or 12 or 13, we start a second game of pretending, which is we're pretending that we're not pretending when we are.
Why do we do that?
We do that in order to play a kind of a secret hero role to ourselves and try to get everybody to acknowledge us as being heroic. And so we're going to pretend like we're really brave when we're scared. We're going to pretend like we're really sad when we're angry. We're going to pretend like we're really angry when we're sad. We're going to pretend whatever looks like is going to get them to give us what we want. And so when you learn to pretend like you're not pretending when you are, that's the problem. That's a big problem. It's called the major problem of adulthood. It's the problem of our whole civilization. It's going to bring about an end to human beings in the world.
So what's the problem? That you pretend that you're not pretending even though you are pretending.
That's right. You know that you're pretending, and you're pretending that you're not pretending for everybody else's benefit.
Which is the same way of saying you're fucking lying.
That's right.
But I still don't understand why everyone does this.
They lie to get what they want, and when they get what they want by lying, they can't enjoy it.
But why don't they just ask for what they want?
Because they might not get it. They're afraid they won't get what they want, so they build a story to con people to manipulate.
They're manipulating.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it.
Okay. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to Health Revealed Part 5. I'm here with Stephanie Mo Davis, Scott Gordon, and Leslie Powers. Say hello, everybody. We're here to radically shift this medical system, the systems we have at large for all of society, and sharing those unique solutions and perspectives you're likely not going to hear anywhere else. If you joined us for our previous parts, you would know that. We've been sharing a lot of statistics and a lot of ideas, unique concepts that You're just not going to hear from the mainstream. But we intend to shift that with your help, and we invite you in this process to share your expertise, your journey with us, wherever you are from, wherever you're at. Because that is how we're going to shift this. We need to learn from folks. We need to ask questions. And that's what we do here within Health Revealed. So thank you very much for joining us. Let us begin. Man's Search for Meaning. If you're not familiar with this work, it's a very good one, talking about purpose and meaning and value within our lives, right? This is Viktor Frankl, a psychologist and neurologist. Frankl's experiences in Nazi concentration camps highlight the extreme authoritarian control exerted over prisoners. The dehumanizing conditions and loss of personal freedoms illustrate the psychological impact of living under an authoritarian regime. However, he has a method of logotherapy which focuses on finding meaning in life, even in the face of suffering. Prisoners typically experienced shock, apathy, and disillusionment. And so Frankl argues that the primary human drive is to find meaning in life, which can be achieved through work, love, and suffering. Even in the most oppressive conditions, individuals can choose their attitude and response, have responsibility, right? Responsibility, and find meaning in their experiences. Finding purpose can help individuals endure and overcome extreme hardships. So, what do you guys think of this idea of meaning and purpose? And have you guys had any experiences within your own practice that reflects this?
I would like to bring up that this is a very, very popular topic over the last couple of years, more and more recently, with the group of people known as the original dark web. So you're looking at Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Eric Weinstein, and now other people are getting into this meaning crisis, termed by John Vervaeke, and a lot of this masculine collective that is waking up to what they're calling the meaning crisis, and that they feel a lot of the issues that we see in today's society regarding health and addiction do simply revolve around this idea of identity and purpose and why am I here? And what's so ironic about the meaning crisis is we're even seeing some of the most recognized and well-renowned philosophers, psychologists, academics, people amongst our world questioning more deeply into their own meaning, even if they've had a specific identity for their entire life. So for me, as I witness this movement of what we call the meaning crisis, it indicates to me as a woman that not only are we searching and grasping for a deeper meaning, but that also revolves around people who've had meaning having the ability to change and evolve if something is calling from within them and beckoning for change. So not just finding meaning, but maybe your meaning needs to change or expand.
Yeah. And I'll add that I think that finding meaning in life and value in yourself is a real turning point in personal healing. And it's like a platform from which, you can really accelerate and deepen your own personal work and find satisfaction in life, even with and despite the hardships and limitations that, you're experiencing or born with.
Yes.
And in my own work, I'm finding myself that people who have grappled with trauma, upset, disappointment in therapy quickly graduate to looking at meaning. In fact, part of that process is reassigning meaning. The original meaning is overwhelmed and traumatized, and that meaning moves up scale, you might say. And then we get into intentions and purposes, and intentions really help a person find orientation, where they're going, and then their purpose is what drives them. So you quickly get to those areas. So they are very important in inner work. That's what the inner work points to.
No matter how recognized you've become in your field at this time in history and contributed into the world, whether it be musically, scientifically, creatively, even if you've achieved the pinnacle in your own field, it's never been more evident that whatever we're doing collectively is not enough. and that it's this more than just the individual, and this relationship between how do I go back within myself and refine myself and learn how to expand my own consciousness, but then how do we come together a little bit better to take our skills harmoniously together and unified together to shift some of these statistics and narratives that we have. So the ones that are negative, that are really, causing a lot of strife for society.
Right. Yeah, we shared a lot of those statistics before, and some of them are certainly impactful, heartbreaking at times, right? Um, and you mentioned, Stephanie, a lot of individuals, some of which identify with religion, and some which identify with atheism, and but they're both coming to this convergence of looking at psychology and these deeper aspects, and I find that to be quite impactful. It's like, why do people go to atheism or religion, and what are they actually seeking at the end of the day? Maybe there are some congruences. Maybe there's some overlap and we don't have to identify with that tribe. And so you do notice with a lot of those individuals, they're not identifying with that group they perhaps identified with in the past. I'm not this, I'm not that. There's this idea of new atheism and atheism, right? Where it's like now it's shifting, and it's quite amazing to see as people are finding out the meaning within their lives.
I think we're starting to grow up a little bit to recognize that we all do things slightly differently. I just watched a conversation with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein the other day, again, talking about this idea of religion versus atheism. And there was a time in history where a lot of these polarities just attacked each other. And now I think what we're starting to come to the realization of is if you're involved in a particular religion or even non-religion, as long as we hold the shared purpose of trying to contribute in a safe and healthy way towards bettering humanity, maybe that's more important than our personal viewpoints.
Yeah, how we carry that out into the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add one more nuance about Viktor Frankl's work, and that is that he developed this in a concentration camp where majority of people around him were going to die. And despite that shortness of life expectancy, he developed this work, this realization of how we can still find meaning in our lives through work, love, and suffering. And I think that inevitably this means that we need to dial back into the present moment awareness and come back to the love in the present moment, the work that we can do right now, and finding meaning in that despite the suffering, and maybe even despite cynicism about the future or hopelessness. It's an amazing kind of formula to work with that sense of hopelessness by coming back to the meaning of now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this brings us to the idea of liberation psychology, which is actually a field of its own. And you'll see there's a lot of psychologists who actually have delved into this aspect. So we'll explain what this is.
Authoritarian regimes use psychological tactics to maintain control and suppress dissent. Individuals often internalize oppression, accepting and justifying their subjugation. Normal abnormality is what he calls for how oppressive conditions can become so ingrained in society that they are seen as normal, even though they are harmful. We must uncover and challenge the ideologies that support authoritarianism, help people recognize social and psychological mechanisms that perpetuate oppression. He shares the concept of conscientization, inspired by Paulo Freire, which focuses on raising awareness among oppressed populations about their social conditions. It is essential for fostering resistance and promoting social change. He advocates for a psychology rooted in the experiences and struggles of marginalized communities, with the aims to empower communities to challenge authoritarian structures and reclaim their agency.
So this idea of normal abnormality, which, we've been discussing quite a bit about how the norms can be challenged by some folks who are then seen as outcasts, right? Not necessarily allowed within the public discussion. And this idea of conscientization, right? Which we can relate to the conscience or consciousness. And we're going to revisit Paulo Freire's work quite a bit. There's a lot of people who have been inspired by his work related to looking at the oppressed and seeing how can they become free. Right now, liberation psychology being, used in other countries other than America, and other places of the world too, can represent, freedom from a very tyrannical condition. But, maybe we can use liberation psychology to understand the condition of all authority and all government that we're looking under statism here, right? We don't have to necessarily just look at the marginalized communities, but the people at large and how their psyche is perhaps being, you can say, oppressed or marginalized by the nature of this class dynamic, where we have certain people respected and seen to be authority figures and certain people who are not. We saw this before, that simply that perception alone can play a toll on the average person. So whether you call them oppressed or not, the average person was willing to do untold amounts of harm on their fellow man simply because an authority told them to do so. So some nuance to understand here, right? We don't want to identify with the victim necessarily or the dominator. We want to look at both of these and look at the bigger picture. So more from Martin Barrow. He argues that to address mental health problems effectively, society itself must be transformed to overcome these oppressive conditions. So rather than an individual approach, maybe there's actually a collective approach here, but not necessarily collectivism, right? Or tribalism, like we talked about before. He emphasized that psychologists and mental health professionals cannot ignore the impact of these difficult contexts on mental health, right? Like, what is the impact of the media or politics? Like, it can be quite hard to determine. But he says if they do, they risk becoming complicit in perpetuating the social injustices that contribute to these mental health issues. In essence, Martin Barrow is advocating for a more socially aware and activist approach to psychology, where professionals work not only to treat individuals, but also to change the societal conditions that harm mental health. Right? Are we willing to challenge the systems or the corporations or the insurance companies or the bigger things at large and not just these individual conditions?
I'd like to point out, because I've lived in outside the United States quite a while and am currently, that this doesn't just apply to third world countries or countries that are supposedly under totalitarianism,
Mhm.
but that the United States of America, the primarily include, I guess you could include Canada, we become very good at minimizing our oppression, minimizing this actual state that we live in. And of course, we champion freedom, which is great because we feel like we live in a country based on freedom. And because we focus on that, which isn't a bad thing, we tend to minimize the contradictions. So that's just something I wanted to point out from an outside viewpoint.
Mm. Yes, we might see some of these different forms of psychologies coming from places that, if you're from America, it's very interesting to look into, right? This is a lot of stuff from Brazil, if I'm correct on that. You'll see a lot of researchers, names I cannot pronounce, but Scott could definitely pronounce. Here's 6 values of liberation psychology, and this is a growing field to fight authoritarianism, and I believe it is on the comeback as people are realizing how important their freedom is and finding meaning within their life and overcoming a lot of the hardships that happen within life. The greatest of hardships, right? Democide, this top cause of death. So number 1 is awareness, the conscious recognition of social injustices and the psychological impact of oppression. It involves understanding how systemic inequalities affect mental health and behavior and fostering a critical consciousness among individuals and communities. Critical consciousness, you could say, is another way of saying conscientiation. This is a word that we used before. Critical realism, this philosophical stance acknowledges the existence of an objective reality while also recognizing that our understanding of this reality is influenced by social, cultural, and historical context. It emphasizes the importance of critically examining the structures and ideologies that shape our perceptions. right? And we may have mentioned before this concept of natural law, but this relies on this idea of an objective, truth or reality that we're having to align our actions toward. Our actions and our behavior and our thoughts may not necessarily align to that. So there's like a goal in mind. There's also de-idealization, the process of uncovering and challenging dominant ideologies that perpetrate oppression. It aims to reveal the hidden power dynamics and biases within societal norms and beliefs, promoting a more equitable and just perspective. Social orientation, the importance of community and collective well-being, not just looking at the individual. How is the social state of humanity? How do people view themselves and others? It advocates for social change and the empowerment of oppressed groups. And then focused on the oppressed, the needs and perspectives of the oppressed and marginalized should be listened to. You can say that's how this whole psychology was created, or why. And methodological eclecticism, the use of diverse and flexible research and intervention methods. It encourages the integration of various approaches and techniques to address complex social issues effectively, adapting to the specific needs and context of the oppressed, right? So when we're looking at this field of psychology, what could we learn from it? There might be a lot of different methods and different researchers, okay?
I really like the balance in all this. Particularly, it's outlined in number 3, take away the ideologies. But also, you see in number 2 a value for truth. So this is not just a left political movement. Liberation psychology has always been thought of as that way. But it's, again, in number 3, trying to take away the ideology. It's balanced. We're looking at the oppressed and the needs and perspectives of the group as well as the individuals. So this is a good approach, in my opinion.
I want to really highlight what you said prior to this slide, Scott, about the truth that in the United States, while we may call ourselves the land of the free and have this idealization of our Constitution and the ideals of our founding fathers, etc., we are really living a very far cry from that ideal in our reality of America right now. And I think there is a lot of indoctrination, and this has been part of my, I guess, awareness building and awakening, if you want to say, to, remembering the words said to me in school, both in, early years, but also in college, where, think of the Pledge of Liberty, the Pledge of, is it the
Allegiance.
Pledge of Allegiance, right? And I pledge allegiance to, all that. These things are very subtle ways that we've been told a story to feel very proud about our freedom. The 4th of July, there's so much that we can think of. And people, I think they believe those things, and that it leads to some of the blinders turning on to looking at what's really happening. So we have to, I think, kind of deconstruct some of those mindsets, those belief systems and worldviews that we were indoctrinated into, and actually look and see if the data backs that up.
Yeah. I mean, we could say that they still are based on statism, that belief in authority. They still have that position that you look up to and you suppress your conscience with. And Stanley Milgram, who did those studies, talked about how if there were camps set in America, they would happen just like they happened in Nazi Germany because there's so many order followers who just do what they're told. So it doesn't matter, what government you title it as. But I can't agree also with, Scott's perspective where he says generally there is more talk and more ideas around freedom. But I would ask about the consistency of that, right? Is there contradiction? Are people really upholding it? Do they know what that is, and to what extent?
Right. And how much marginalization and oppression is actually here in the United States that is perhaps overlooked.
Hmm.
And we can look in the healthcare system and really see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to add in quickly is the idea of understanding the mental personal responsibility side of this is that we may not feel suppressed or have oppression directly coming on us, but that doesn't mean that we are oppressed. We're not oppressing ourselves within our own mind, within our own psyche. And I think in the up until very recently, most of us either learn educationally in a system approach or we learn experientially. And we're not really taught to value the discernment. We're not really told how to value getting to know thyself, having the ability to discern mentally. So we're used to having experiences and failing and trying again. And I'll do that different next time because that way didn't work. Ideally, you want to do the inner work sooner and not waiting until you're broken and you're on your knees to really understand the value of getting to know thyself and acquiring discernment. That wastes a lot of time.
Yes.
The concept is to turn things back on ourselves now and teach the next generation the value of knowing thyself, of discernment, how to make proper healthy choices, how to, adhere to moral principles, and to gain that more broader spiritual view to align so we're not constantly cleaning up our messes from not having the mind in the right space and the ability to have the discernment that we need to navigate the pressures of society.
And I would add to that includes then looking at the environment that we are raised in. And if that environment is healthy, then we don't have as much to fear and maybe as much internal work to do because it kind of keeps us in check. And that environment really supports us so we can perhaps do that inner work. So, that's kind of like looking at the collective or societal level and then looking at the individual is looking at the environment and then looking at, the internal, right? So the external, internal.
Yeah, there's two environments. There's your external oppression and your internal oppression. And a lot of times you don't realize the internal suppression because there's layers of psychic debris that have built up over our lifetime if we have trauma as a child that we just are not aware of yet. We have not come to conscious of what actually has happened to us and how it's been impacting our life until we find ourselves making the same mistakes and looping in the same patterns over and over again. So we have to come to conscious what needs to come up so we can work on healing and integrating that so we can be a more well-informed and healthy human being. But you can't see what you can't see. You don't know what you don't know. So there's a lot that needs to come to consciousness. And I think that's where we stand right now is there is a breakthrough of things wanting to come to consciousness in the light, to be seen, to be integrated. And we have forces working against us to keep that consciousness suppressed, which creates a war on consciousness and our inability to truly evolve in a sovereign way.
Yeah, perhaps we need to know more about liberation psychology. And the similar field, critical psychology, you can see there's a bunch of researchers on the top there, some of prominent names in these fields, but there's many, many more. Community approaches, and they can include empowerment programs, grassroots movements, and what they call PAR, which is participatory action research. Therapeutic approaches, this includes trauma-informed care, group therapy, and resilience building. Educational programs, this includes critical pedagogy, which includes critical thinking and awareness, civic education, this could include of natural rights or this idea of natural law, and workshops and seminars. Media and communication approaches, this includes awareness campaigns, storytelling, social media activism, case studies, which includes the examination of successful resistance movements and their psychological strategies, how authoritarianism is resisted in various cultural and political settings, highlighting universal principles of liberation. So here you have just a slide jam-packed with different potential solutions and approaches used within liberation and critical psychology.
Corey, I just want to say something. I really felt this in my heart as I was reading over this, realizing all of these things that we have to do to just simply be empowered and come to consciousness. All of these methods, all of these things we have to return upon to get where we would have maybe liked to be at this point or not. But what really hits me in the heart when I read this is we have not even yet, at least in America, from what I see, where I sit, been able to admit that we have collective trauma. I mean, it just breaks my heart to really come to realize that we are still trying and masking and performing And whatever we're doing, we just simply can't admit. Personally, there are people coming forth and particular providers. Gabor Mate is a huge influence, but the whole entire medical system, everybody being treated at mass scale for chronic illness and lifestyle conditions. I'm not hearing anyone on a mass scale saying we have a case of collective and personal trauma and we need to address this, admit it, let's talk about it openly, and let's work towards improving it. How can we even apply this stuff if we're not even willing to say how we've done it up to this point might not be the best of ways? We realize we have a collective issue, I included, you included, my boss included, and we're finally ready to hit this head on.
You're right. There might be some simplicity that we are perhaps overlooking. I mean, for instance, even looking at statism alone is a concept that a lot of even these researchers don't know about as a term, but as simple as the premises of that is, the idea of authority vested in certain human beings, it has been grossly overlooked. I mean, by all the psychologies we can look at. Um, you don't see this idea of like, what is that belief doing within itself? But rather you look at the remnants of it and just conformity as a whole and authoritarianism in its, aggregation, but not necessarily like down to the fundamental of like, what is it actually? Does it have any legitimacy? And so, it's this is why we're here to ask these deeper questions that some of these researchers aren't looking at, but we invite them because clearly they have a lot of amazing strategies. So I'm sure there's people who are, nowadays who are still practicing some of this, right? And maybe parts of the world we don't know about, maybe different parts of the countries we don't know about. And it'd be interesting to highlight that and to bring that to a more public stage. Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Here we talk about Paulo Freire, where he was mentioned quite a bit among other researchers for coining this term critical consciousness, right? So he says education must empower the oppressed to regain their humanity and achieve liberation. Now, I think it's important to the idea of regaining our humanity. We talked about before how we can move toward a very robotic, technological left brain world. I think this relates, right? If we aren't free, are we really human at the end of the day? Well, critical consciousness enables the oppressed to recognize and challenge their oppression. We should use the dialogical method, he says, a dialogue between teacher and student, fostering mutual learning and critical thinking. Traditional education treats students as empty vessels, which, could be seen as like a banking model, to be filled with knowledge. And he actually says this reinforces oppression. He shares the concept of praxis, right, which is reflection and action, and that it's essential for transformative education and social change. Similarly, psychologists Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman detail how individual well-being is linked with social transformation, how we need to create real educational environments, tap into historical or collective memory, and use helpful modalities. And some of this includes community healing circles, narrative therapy, or the dialogical approach, bridging divides and PAR, we mentioned before, or CBPR, activism, advocacy, and expressive arts, right? So going into creativity. So notice, these are very unique approaches. Something I will say is praxis. You'll come across something called praxology. If you study freedom and study economics and then psychology, and you relate these together, you can look into that whole field of its own, praxology. Another thing is when I hear dialogical method, I think of Socratic method. I think of what Larkin Rose created, a program called Candles in the Dark, where he teaches others how to talk to others and simply ask questions to help themselves see this belief system statism. So he's actually using this method, whether he knows it or not, from a psychologist who's also using a very similar method. I think that can be quite telling.
I just want to highlight where we're at here. Again, these are brilliant ideas and brilliant concepts. But if you really think about this, what are we promoting? Talking together without judgment, sitting together and healing in nature. I mean, this blows my mind. This is the first principles of living in a state of harmony and love. But we have gotten so far away and so enmeshed in worldly things and so far away from our own true soul and nature that literally we now have to create entire fields to remind us of what we already are.
Yeah. Wow. That's a good point.
This is very similar to my therapeutic approach and the difference between the authoritarian approach as well. The authoritarian approach, you need the practitioner to tell the patient what's wrong. If he's allowed to speak very much, there's still going to be an evaluation based on what he said. And this other approach, the Socratic method, is opposite, and it's designed to allow the person to find out for themselves what's wrong or what their view is, able to determine their own condition, and let's say, and describe that, and their own conclusions about it. And so a processor or a therapist becomes a facilitator. So this is very much applied to the group, and what I'm doing is applied to the individual. And what Corey described Larkin Rose is doing is this is outside of any formal session. How do you speak to people that allows them to continue a self-determined venue or vein of thinking so that eventually they can reach a conclusion that is really from them? And so this goes back to the question. And this is the essence of good therapy is, are you asking the right questions? Because the right questions get to where you need to go.
Yes, this could be quite a start for anybody listening out there who has clients or has family or has friends, and they're curious, how do I, help them see these really powerful truths, even if it's about my own health condition, and I can't convey it to them. I don't know how. They're resistant to me and sharing things that I think are important to look at in the world as a whole. And how do we address democide, this top cause of unnatural death? How do we even start? It could seem like it's overwhelming. Well, here are some of the building blocks to how we get there, from a practitioner point of view, but also the everyday person simply asking questions to their neighbor and their family and their friends.
They always say you can always determine how enlightened you actually are when you get into a heated conversation with your family. So if we could just consider really, truly speaking with our family and our ones closest to us with that, asking questions, trying to be non-judgmental, trying to truly understand with love. If we can just start in our everyday interactions, maybe we can communicate this better within the masses.
Mhm. And so, like Scott said, there's this flip side to it, which is equally important to look at. So we're constantly going to do this reflection so we can see, the differences here. The authoritarian dynamic, Karen Stenner, a psychologist, authoritarianism is a psychological predisposition towards order, conformity, and security. She conducted several experiments for her findings, and this is what she found. Heightened threat perception meant greater support for strong leadership, stricter laws, desiring punitive measures, and having intolerance against outgroups. Older individuals and those with lower educational levels are more likely to exhibit authoritarian tendencies when faced with societal threats. Interviews with extreme authoritarians revealed a deep-seated need for order and security, often stemming from early life experiences and socialization. We talked about this before as well, this idea of your childhood being very important and the educational system. Interviews with extreme libertarians, on the other hand, emphasize the value of individual freedom and diversity even in the face of societal threats. So, sort of as if they were unfazed, their principles really led the way. Very interesting. Intolerance, however, is rooted in authoritarianism, leading to racism, political intolerance, moral intolerance, and punitiveness. It is to be found a universal, predictable response, she says, to perceived threats among those with authoritarian predispositions. Authoritarian attitudes are activated by societal threats, which include public dissension, and loss of confidence in leaders. So isn't that interesting how authoritarianism is bred here, right? And we talked about before some of the cycles that can happen too in history. So if you want to connect some of the dots here, you can see this.
I just wanted to highlight what popped in my head, which was the impact of media on the heightened threat perception,
Right.
and just advising people to be very cautious about, indulging in lots of news, and the media, because I think that it thrives on creating big, big emotional reactions and inducing fear and thinking something terrible is going to happen. So we have to watch out for that.
Yeah.
And we have to keep in mind that the fear-based authoritarianism, particularly the extreme version in the middle of our slide here, where it says interviews with extreme authoritarians, all that is based in trauma. And the reason authoritarians crave the order and security is because trauma is a moment of extreme disorder and extreme insecurity. And so psychologically, and this applies to all of us, we're seeking to resolve moments of trauma, extreme disorder, and insecurity with something external, like a political party, authority figures as a solution. So these are all solutions. We know they don't work, and yet we don't often see anything different or better. And so we really need to become aware of real solutions. Otherwise, we tend to fall back on what is safe, what feels safe, or what appears to be safe.
It's a natural drive, a very physiological and psychological drive to seek safety. It's part built into our nervous system. And that natural phenomenon can easily be disrupted by trauma, as you said, and exploited by those seeking to exercise control or authority over us by activating our fear, activating our sense of being threatened, and then we can so easily then defer our power to someone else to keep us safe.
When we're born into trauma or experience trauma when we're young, again, we don't have the emotional capacity to process what's happening, right? So we create these psychic levels of either low level of stress or survival within our little system. And then as time proceeds, when they're not getting addressed, we're adding more of these psychic layers that actually mostly are unconscious. So I think one of the difficulties here with seeing this phenomenon is that, again, a lot of us are still operating externally in the world without having to come to consciousness yet within their own trauma dynamics within them. And a lot of times, these patterns build up, and craving the authority is just this instinctual self-preservation mode. Because if for some reason I wasn't safe, I feel deeply within me something's going to unravel. And what that is all of the psychic debris that has been built up over the years that will most likely unravel. So I think at some of the roots of this is that people do unconsciously seek this dynamic. It's not always consciously because their trauma hasn't yet to come to consciousness, because something deep within them is just saying, it's a self-preservation instinct, is like, if I don't do this, I feel that something within me doesn't feel right about not having an authority figure, because deep within them, what will happen is ego degradation. So there's this unconscious, maybe it's conscious, but a lot of times it's unconscious self-preservation of an ego degradation that will completely disrupt everything about their identity as it is in this moment.
And we mentioned this idea before of collective memory. Well, when you guys mention trauma, we know sometimes it can be uh, something in the past, right? Oftentimes something that can even be generational, that is passed over and over again. So if we have this collective memory of, wow, this big thing happened in history, Nazi Germany, Stalin, all these leaders, or slavery we gave as an example before. I mean, these were deeply traumatic experiences, and now we don't have that anymore. Do we still have some of those remnants within us where we want to have that security, and then we're finding out, do we really need that? Because now it's like we're living without all that oppression that we had in our former years as humanity. So now we're starting to, I think, ask more questions because we don't have that anymore. We've moved beyond that one form. So maybe we have to create and continue that evolution that we're on, that trajectory toward more freedom.
Gabor Mate really champions in his trauma work the concept of understanding that it's not so much the direct experience, it's the perception of the direct experience by the victim. So again, you could question somebody and challenge their trauma and say, well, what so bad happened to you when you were a kid? How did you have it so bad? We don't really know yet. And I think we're just starting to come to understand what Corey, you were talking about, what a lot of epigeneticists are starting to talk about is that we might be just born into trauma. And then additional traumas that happen collectively or familiarly are just emphasizing what we're born into. How do we really know? Again, that's why, from my opinion, is that we could get a little bit further, a little bit quicker if we just opened ourselves up to acknowledge that this is a real phenomenon. We don't have all of the answers, but if we can just admit that it exists rather than fighting it and saying, well, you grew up in America, how much trauma did you have? Instead of resisting this, let's just embrace that it exists so we can move forward with some of the solutions.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? The justifications and excuses that people come up with. And Larkin Rose even has a whole chart talking about this in his Candles in the Dark seminar of tunnels, which are avenues that people try to distract themselves from confronting the questions that are being brought up to them. They don't want to face those questions, so they start changing the topic, right? And they start making these different accusations, like you just mentioned. Oh, well, you live in America, or what about this, or what about that? They start going off into different tangents, but not answering the question. And so, can we really confront the issue at hand?
To admit that someone else has trauma and to open our hearts up to that is also, it makes us vulnerable to seeing it within us. So if we can resist it and shame it in someone else, then we don't have to look at anything within us.
Mm. Right. And this is also, on part of the practitioner or the person asking questions, why it's important for them to also not attack, the person they're trying to help. Right. Because if they're asking a bunch of questions and all of a sudden something triggers them, now they're also off topic and now they're not contributing to what they want actually to be done. So something to pay attention to. It's like you might be the one asking questions, but you still have to keep yourself in line.
One thing that makes me excited when I talk to having this panel here and
Mhm.
other friends that I know is that there is something happening where we're starting to recognize that somebody in a perceived authority figure position, such as a therapist or a healthcare provider, when I see that there are providers coming to their own consciousness and doing their own inner work to be able to show up for their friends, their patients, even their colleagues in a state of thoughtful awareness and radical honesty and working as equals. This is where in the healthcare system right now, or recently, there's been a huge movement towards what we call this ideology of participatory care, right? It's like, oh, everybody's involved. It's a participated effort, right? But who's done the self work? It's like a good idea, but you can't really get anywhere until we all go back and turn the work amongst ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And here, you have more research showing this. This was from the Oxford Handbook, several researchers on authoritarianism, and they said that political and structural factors create identity uncertainty and economic instability, leading to stronger support for populist leaders who exploit these uncertainties. Now, the use of the term populist, this is a term I actually used to identify with, I'll be honest, in previous years when I was of this status mindset myself and not looking at the psychology of things, is usually associated with somebody who wants more freedom for the people, right? And you see this among a lot of the language used in America is we the people for the people and we get to decide. But this gets a lot of people on their side for these leaders. It gets a lot of people behind them. And that can be used for this type of exploitation. So people with the strong needs for security and certainty want a protector, which is commonly used by populist and authoritarian leaders. People with submission, aggression, and conventionalism more likely see authority as inherently moral, right? And it's important to recognize here because you might say populism is the exact opposite of authoritarianism, but if this person's still claiming authority over you, one may appear to be very authoritarian. You would say, I don't want to follow him, but this one person sounds really nice. Sounds like they're really speaking to you. They're still, by their actions, claiming authority over you. Is that moral within itself? And so authoritarian leaders exploit uncertainty by offering simple, clear-cut identities and solutions, thus attracting support. Group identity and intergroup conflict can heighten feelings of in-group loyalty and out-group hostility, which authoritarian leaders can manipulate. At the end of the day, we might find out these two, populist and authoritarianism, kind of interrelate, right? Which I think a lot of people may not want to admit to. They want to say this one side's bad, this one side is good, this person's for the people, this person wants to destroy everything. Maybe that's the dichotomy that the leaders want us in, right? And maybe we have to think like that. But let's look at the psychology of it, even if you're unsure. What is actually happening? Is statism being questioned? Societies with strong hierarchical structures and collectivist values may be more accepting of authoritarian rule. People rationalize through cognitive dissonance inequalities and injustices by believing that the system is fair and legitimate, even if it disadvantages them. And they have different identifications they use to show how there's certain types of forms of obedience here. There's a preference for hierarchy or social domination, and that is differentiated from obedience and submission to authority, right? We talked before how this term authority can be used in the medical field or among scientists, and that's not necessarily the same authority that we're talking about as rulers and people who want to rule over you. Now, they also identify the authoritarian personality, a personality type characterized by rigid adherence to conventional values and submission to authority figures. So, quite self-explanatory. At this point, if you're in the seminar, you're going to get some new insights, but you're going to start seeing some common themes among the previous researchers too. So here's another unique solution you may not know about, one that I actually find extremely intriguing. Somatherapy, which is actually called an anarchist therapy, because the psychiatrist who invented this form of therapy, which, I could say invented, he was inspired by a lot of other researchers as well, called himself an anarchist openly. And so Soma is a type of group therapy inspired by Wilhelm Reich that was developed especially for people who have experienced slavery, been tortured, and or currently live under the control of repressive governments. The goal of Soma is to awaken people to their natural access to freedom and fulfillment. I like that idea of natural access, right? Freire is explicitly anarchist in his therapy, challenging people involved in its therapy and psychotherapists as a whole to refuse conformism and submission. Soma was created as a combination of play, response, reflection, experimentation, and challenge. Everything taking place within a cohesive group setting in order to facilitate honest, independent character growth. He mentions that there are radicals who scream or fight but don't do anything. If we want change, we must change the individuals. Okay, so again, individuals, society level, he's looking at both here. He's integrating a lot of different aspects into this type of therapy. And this idea of soma is something I I see quite often now, right? Soma therapy, somatic experiencing. And I'm sure the people who practice somatic experiencing don't know about somatherapy, but there's generally the same principles at hand here.
And this approach is consistent with the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who in his famous book, The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about using things like psychotherapy and psychodrama and other types of arts as ways to heal trauma and access our inner self and our autonomy, right? To heal from traumas. And we'll get into more of his work as we go along.
Yes.
I just wanted to add real quick on the somatherapy is when we're traumatized, the proclivity to dissociate is high and to not be embodied. It's too painful to be in the body. We don't want to feel. So we numb out, we can become addicts. we disassociate, we can even spiritually bypass, which is a really popular one, right? Try to just become too spiritual that we're not even in the body. So this concept of somatherapy helps people to return back into their body with a place of creating their own safe foundations, right? And then from that place of being grounded and safe in the body, we have that groundedness to start to work through the next level, which would be emotional processing. So we can start to do this kind of reverse engineering of healing. Whereas now, the primary approach typically has been you're stressed, you're traumatized, go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and we're going to go into the mind. Very difficult to address the mind when you don't even feel safe in your own body.
Yeah, I sometimes think of it as we can go from the inside out or the outside in to create shifts and change in our system. And this idea of working with the body and with movement and acting as if exercise, emotion, psychodrama, all is sort of the outside in approach. And it's very powerful because so much of our trauma exists in our body and frees us into rigid patterns. And these approaches can unstick those rigidity.
One of the primary reasons for practicing and teaching yoga, which has been a big part of my healing process and my career, has been that the body holds tension. Stress and tension settle into the body. So if you are somebody who is more of an empath, or you've grown up hypersensitive because of your trauma, you have to find that way to get back into the body and to be able to work with the body and move the tension. Sometimes that low level of stress just exists all the time. Even if as an adult, even if you're not in the trauma, the low level of stress and the pattern and the survival is already ingrained in your system. So to be able to get into the body in the present moment, feel that safety, and start with the first principles of I'm safe here and now in my physicalness, we can tend to rewrite the script. So that's why I love this therapy as well.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I did not really look or consider the idea of exercise as much as I should have. And I don't know how many people underestimate that, but I did not think about that. And really I think this really helped emphasize the role of that. Scott, do you want to read this slide for us talking about the components of somatherapy?
Okay. Soma focuses on group dynamics to foster creativity and emotional freedom. Exercises emphasize the relationship between physical movement and emotional expression. Capoeira Angola integrates this martial art to enhance physical and emotional resilience. Having its roots in African rituals, in Brazil, it was shaped through centuries by the resistance against slavery and oppression. It wasn't until the 1930s that capoeira ceased to be persecuted as a felony under Brazilian law. By playing capoeira Angola, slaves in Brazil would not only prepare themselves to fight their oppressors by strengthening their bodies, but also by reaffirming their vivacity, would reconnect with the life force that slavery and domination intended to crush.
Wow, isn't that incredible? A multi-layered solution there. And it's like, yeah, they're building strength mentally and physically. And it had to be persecuted as a felony under law. I mean, gosh, this is a therapy helping people. I mean, how insane is that? I
I
found
think
that
we have
incredible.
an incredible missed opportunity in our world, in the West at least, where I live, to not integrate something like meditation, yoga, martial arts, qigong, karate into anybody that is struggling with any chronic illness. I think we've radically missed the mark.
Yeah, I think that capoeira really demonstrates the human spirit under oppression and that drive to find creative ways to hold on to one's internal sovereignty and to be prepared no matter what is being told to us by the outside. It's a very inspiring practice. And it also includes sound and like music, voice, which is also another powerful aspect to the therapeutic transformation.
Mhm. Very interesting. And when you talk about exercise, you may talk about this idea of the muscular armor. So Freire decided that this therapy was best suited for, well, actually, the martial arts that he chose was best suited for somatherapy because it's a more playful style in which the practitioners maintain a more relaxed posture, doing movements closer to the ground, engaging the entire body more equally and therefore offering a complete bioenergetic exercise that massages the player's muscular armor. As postulated by Reich, the muscular armor is the chronic rigidity in the body that prevents the full circulation of the bioenergy or orgone, right? So these are ideas. If you're not familiar with this, this is a whole field of study. Reich argued that the muscular armor and the character armor are the same, meaning that behavioral and emotional patterns can be affected through action on body rigidity and vice versa. Reich realized that neurosis is located not only in one's mind, but also in his or her body. Freire created more than 40 exercises that are organized in meaningful orders and sequences, and that essentially is somatherapy.
It's referring a lot to the fascia, that interconnected web of connective tissue, fibrous tissue that covers the sheath of our muscles. And it's so funny, my yoga teacher used to say to me, the issues are always in your tissues.
Of these sayings you got here, Stephanie, coming off here with all these different sayings.
Yeah. It's so true, Stephanie, and I'm so glad you brought up the fascia. I have a friend who is a yoga teacher, and she's recently delved into fascia yoga. And I've been lucky enough to get to go practice with her. And I've had some surgeries and neck issues, and doing this work with her has really opened up my body, which has a strong impact on my emotional and mental health, honestly. So.
Do you know, I just saw a study that said that cancer tends to settle in the old vulnerabilities of the body,
Mm.
any old injuries, past injuries. So, I mean, this is incredible work that we are missing out on if we're not participating. I mean, some people write it off and they see exercise as a luxury, right? But honestly, I think that we will come to realize more and more each day that it's a joint show, the mind and the body, and we need to have equal attention on both if we want to heal and transform.
Yeah. Well, here we can break it down even further. In the first stages of the therapy, the exercises have a more introductory nature. As the therapy unfolds, they will have stronger bioenergetic effects and will explore more deeply the participant's behavior and character armor. Bioelectrical variations associated with different emotional states and sensations have even been measured in the skin. This is called the psychogalvanic reflex. For that reason, for most soma exercises, it is better to wear light clothing. It does not deal with traumas of the past, but it does deal with the manifestations in the present through the situations experienced during the exercises in everyday life. Freire understands that one of the many problems that people have is related to inability to define what they want and like. He believes that spontaneous self-regulation is achieved by the search for pleasure and by the discovery of each person's own unique originality. Children know how to interact in this manner instinctively, but as we grow up, we tend to lose that ability by becoming inhibited, serious, or simply formal. You can meet and chat with people for years without ever feeling as connected to them as you did after such interactions. I mean, really, there's interviews with people who have gone through this therapy, and they say, "Yeah, I felt this connection I never even felt with my own family, with my own friends, through doing these therapies with people because they built that like emotional body connection." And I found that so fascinating, right? It's like we used to have in our society a lot of songs and dances and things that perhaps made us unique. It also was quite fun. I mean, you think of like old times and the tribes dancing around a fire, playing a bunch of music under the stars at night. I mean, what what happens to our society that loses touch with that? Doesn't have that anymore. I think that is so reflective.
For sure, Corey.
Go
And I
ahead,
just
Liz.
want to add the benefits of something like social partner dance as a way of stepping into a dynamic with another person that requires sort of a deep presence and a listening around leading and following and being in your body and, you know, bringing in your thinking brain with your body and then moving on to more expression, you know, as you can, as you don't have to think so much about your steps, right? And that these are things that are therapeutic that we can bring on into our everyday life. We don't have to call it therapy, but you
Right.
know, there are these wonderful activities available to us that could benefit, you know, everyone.
Mhm.
Anybody who starts to practice yoga more seriously, not just a dabbler, anybody as a teacher for, you know, I've taught for 15 years, everybody knows this as a yoga teacher. If you get somebody who's serious, give them about, if they're coming weekly or bi-weekly, it usually takes about a month before you're waiting for that moment in shavasana, which is the pose at the end of class where you're just in your body laying on the floor after the sweaty practice, connecting your breath with your body. You're just waiting with a box of tissues because you know the newbie's going to break down. It happens every time. A massive purging, a massive crying. It happens all the time. And you ask them, you know, you want to talk about it, you want to stay after class, here's some tissues. And literally what comes through their mouth is so simple and so beautiful, yet so sad, is things like, I haven't connected with my breath like that ever. Or I just realized that that was the first moment I felt anything in the last 5 years. I mean, you hear these very profound statements, and that those tears are flowing from a state of reconnection and the realization of how long they've been disconnected from themselves. So, anybody who has the ability to do any sort of somatic work, I highly encourage it. One other thing, Leslie, to your comment about partner dancing, is that partner aspect is really fun too. I recently took some fencing classes here, and with some experts that were training me, and just that back and forth playfulness of power and helping and giving and receiving, so incredibly therapeutic.
Yeah. And another angle, you know, is I remember going to a chiropractor, having an X-ray, and but during the adjustment of my neck, I had an emotional release and was very kind of sensitive, you know, and emotional. And we went into the room and he was showing me the X-ray and he pointed to an injury in my neck, and he was able to actually pinpoint within like a year or two, based on what he observed in this X-ray, as to when I had a neck trauma. And so it was pretty amazing to me, both his astuteness, right, and the ability to see in the body where an injury occurred and when, that was accurate, and then the emotional release of that body work, you know, and also
Wow.
with maybe deep massage, I've had people will have those emotional releases as well, because the emotion is held in the body, in the muscular tissues and fascia. And, yeah.
Mhm.
There's an emerging field right now in chiropractics where they're starting to realize that something is contributing to a lot of modern lifestyle, not lifestyle conditions, but conditions like POTS and vertigo. A lot of these conditions that we're seeing more recently has to do with this compression of the cervical spine. And there's particular machines that literally, just at the back of the head right here, they're just focused on that area of compression. There's whole chiropractic places opening up now. I forget exactly what it's called, but are just focusing on this area at the very low portion of the skull and at the top of the C1, C2 area, just on that area. But there's something very special and unique with people that have specific traumas around releasing tension in and around the back of the skull there. And I remember when I went to school for massage therapy, there's these two softer points behind the skull, right back in here on either side, that we were always taught massage those, you can feel the tension, and there's a lot of emotion stored in that area of the skull there. So just very interesting what we're coming to realize, and the obviousness that our stress and tension is held in the body. And if we focused on working through this tension and stress within the body first and foremost, how much less medication maybe would we be prescribing for stress and tension? I would love to see that being
Yeah,
promoted.
isn't there a type of therapy? It's in, naturopathic, homeopathic medicine, where they massage the back of the neck. It goes by a certain name. You know what the name is?
Cranial sacral
Yes.
therapy.
Yes, cranial. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's been around a while. This other method is a little different, where they actually
Mm,
adjust the skull with a machine, but there
right.
is something very profound with the cranial sacral connection. And if you think about it, between the sacrum and the cranium is your spine, right? So a lot of yogic philosophy, and one of my other yoga teachers used to always say to me, you're only as old as your spine, because every nerve channel through your entire body runs through your spinal column. And if there's compression and there's tension that's built up over long periods of time, the bioenergetics of the body and the electricity within the body cannot flow freely. Then we have bioenergetic blocks and tension. And this even relates to things like Kundalini, where the serpent energy runs up the spinal column and awakens the entire system to a higher state of consciousness. So if our body is so tense and rigid, we can't quite get there. And the last little phrase I'll throw out today, Corey, for you is another yoga teacher: tight mind, tight body. It's connected. So you can't open up to higher states of consciousness and being if your body's a wreck.
I've reflected on that in some of my psychotherapy work, where I've noticed that the rigidity of the mind, the rigidity of the thoughts, the clinging on to present ways of thinking is very connected to the rigidity of the body, and that through working with the body, one can help loosen up the mind and vice versa. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah,
That's
and
exactly what I was going
yeah,
to
go ahead.
go over, because I deal primarily in what others would call cognitive therapy or talk therapy. And first of all, I'd like to say that this shows a lot of promise, especially in what Leslie said about opening up a memory during an adjustment, those kind of things. Because yes, it's true. A lot of this is in the muscular tissue of the body. And if you can do some kind of energetic work or energetic therapy, then that's going to be a very valuable contributor and get through your talk therapy faster. But the other thing, and this is something that not many people who may have test some people's assumptions, and that is there's kind of an assumption that I've noticed that cognitive therapy doesn't get, to the emotions or to the, and I want to kind of challenge that by saying that I've done a great deal of cognitive therapy. And I remember very clearly, I was very aware that I was a very stiff and rigid person. And I did a little bit of somatic type therapies. I did rebirthing a couple of times. But then I had a long period of the last 20 years of doing only the cognitive. And I have to say that gradually doing cognitive therapy may be the long way if you're not also doing the energetic work, but it does get there eventually. So there is an interaction between mind and body, and loosening up thoughts in the mind will eventually manifest in the body. Now, what I would, go back to saying is that ideally, if you could combine these two or alternate these two, you've got a pretty good program for confronting trauma, not only in as it's acting on your body, but as it, as you straighten out, as we say, straighten out the mind and your thoughts. So these two should be seen as interactive and complementary.
Yes.
Yeah, I love what Scott was saying, because I experienced that on both ends, Scott. when I was thrown into the medical system with my chronic illness, there was absolutely no discussion of the mind-body connection, right? It was just treatment protocol. And coming from a yogic background, I understood the profound importance of including my mind and body into my experience. But conversely, for those people who are yogis, who haven't, Western yogis, who haven't experienced chronic illness or the medical system, a lot of times they'll want to go the complete natural route and they'll just get into yoga and they'll become prolific in their yoga practice without really understanding when the emotions arise and what to do with them. It's like they're doing it as a physical form of fitness, but then the emotions do come up. And I saw this in the yoga world in the late 90s to the early 2000s, when I was really big into the yoga movement here in the United States, is that we were doing yoga long enough collectively, majority women in the States at that time, right? What happened was, it was like we opened Pandora's box and nobody knew what to do with the emotions. Nobody was skilled enough to take the person to the next step. We kind of understood that we were opening things and releasing things, but what Scott's saying, I believe, is what was needed for the next step of integration, which we didn't have at that time proficiently. So.
And I think that goes back to meaning when we opened this discussion. Viktor Frankl and his work on meaning, I think what you're describing is you're releasing the energy and the mass, but the meaning hasn't been assigned to it to kind of straighten things out in mentally. And so, yes, these things can go back and forth and alternate and can work very well if done so. And I think if you come to that's a good observation, because if you come to a point where you feel like you're stuck, you may want to look at the other therapy and get moving on that, because there may need to be left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot alternation going, because I found that in other areas of cognitive therapy works very well to work on the body, then work on the mind, work on the body. And just to give people that may need a little bit of an idea of what I'm getting at when I say cognitive approach, if you talk about a part of the body that's ill or injured, you can actually create some changes with it. And so that's been my experience in therapy. So that the two interact very much, and neither one should be neglected.
Scott, just to highlight the power of what you just said, was exactly my focus that I had when I was working on my nonprofit called Awakening Healthcare. So as a 2-time transplant patient, I have a long time experience being in the medical institution and how they treat and focus on healing the patient. I have discovered there is such an incredible lack of that integration that you're talking about, and the ability for somebody to find and discover the meaning within their illness experience. That I have witnessed countless and countless people who've overcome something very serious, maybe an organ transplant or even a cancer diagnosis, but that integration and meaning part of it has not been opened, and there hasn't been any true real recognition around how can I create this story now in a way that empowers me, right? So what you see is so many people getting stuck within their illness experience. And I know countless people who they just constantly talk about, I'm an organ transplant recipient and I'm an advocate for organ transplant, but there's no true meaning in how they move beyond that. They're stuck highlighting the process or even the protocol or prescription or surgery. They highlight that part of the process, but then they can't make meaning of it to move forward in a more integrated fashion for the rest of their life. They stay stuck talking about that condition.
And sadly, these modalities that we've highlighted are hard to access for many people. There's a financial component, an economic component, and the healthcare, most insurances don't pay for these services, or they pay for them only in limited amounts of time. And so there's an access problem for many people.
Yeah. If I can just say one thing to anybody watching, is that if you do have an insurance plan, I obviously have some interesting insurance considering I've had 2 transplants. if you have an insurance plan, call and see if there's any natural modalities that your insurance will contribute to or cover. So, for instance, I just recently found out that my insurance will cover, I think it was up to 20 acupuncture visits with a $20 copay. So that's something. So anybody who's watching and feels like they can't afford something and you do have a healthcare plan, call and make sure that there's not something they cover. The other thing I found out is that my insurance covers a gym membership. Okay. I got a gym membership, but then what's at the gym? I get free classes. So now I
Wow.
have access to yoga classes. So please, anybody watching who's got insurance, at least just call before you say, I can't afford to participate. Call to make sure it's not being covered somehow or some way.
Mm. Yeah, now we have information at our fingertips. We could just go on YouTube, say, hey, I want to learn this martial art. I
Yeah,
started with
that's
Tai Chi myself, and then I started doing research. I found out there's a Buddhist temple that has free Qigong, and they take donation only. And they do it every week, and they have like a meditation center, and they have a retreat, and it's really cool. They actually have a retreat where they don't talk for several days. Very unique approaches to this. And if you just do a simple search on like cranial sacral therapy, right? I mean, just you'll see online, oh, there's no data, it's not scientific, but there's countless people who say it helped them. And you tend to see that with a lot of natural homeopathic remedies. And can we deny the patient or the person who says, hey, it helped me?
I want to bring up a fact that Leslie just said, which is really important, is this idea of access, is that we do have an access problem. There's no doubt about that. But I
Mhm.
think as a patient myself, when you're struggling with something and you feel oppressed or you feel like you don't have access, you tend to actually lose vision of what you do have access to. So I'm guilty of this. There was a time where I had to say, you know what, maybe there are more things available for me than I realize, and I have to just reach out and search. And when I put myself out there, like Corey said, there's free classes all over the place and meetups where you can talk about stuff. So I think part of that limitation is also realizing when we're limiting ourselves and not just
Yep.
reaching out into the community as best as we can to see what is available out there with others.
Mhm.
The other point I want to make is that part of valuing ourselves is really spending our money on these things of value, of deep value. So, and I also think there's value to supporting these private practitioners, the cranial sacral worker, the yoga teacher. This is part of how we can shift this dynamic in society and put our money where our mouth is and demonstrate what we value through the spending of our money. And then I also think that working with those folks, you can sometimes do trades and you can have some negotiations. There's a lot more flexibility. And it's sort of a win-win that I think is one of the solutions to some of the problems that we're facing in the healthcare field.
Leslie, you touched on a wound, and I have to bring it up, is that the holistic healthcare provider, the healing arts provider, tend to not make a lot of money. And a lot of them tend to suffer. And it's sad because I had this experience when I was a yoga teacher. You barely make enough money to survive. And it's awful because you're changing people's lives in each and every class profoundly. And it sickens me at times. I've had this experience where I know a lot of yoga studios and healing art studios closed down over the pandemic. That was the death of what they could afford. But yet you see larger, more grandiose additions being added on to every single hospital. And I'm thinking to myself, come on, guys, this is a tremendous imbalance. We need to support our healing arts practitioners too, who are doing a lot of cleanup work from stuff that you missed. Why can't we have some sort of an honoring and equal balance of what's being going on? I mean, personally, I would be a yoga teacher right now again if I could afford to solely do that, but you can't. If you have to rent a space or open, have your own business. Sadly, a lot of providers in the healing arts that I knew only could truly sustain themselves if they had yoga teacher training, several month-long yoga teacher trainings. That was the only way that they could survive to stay open. So I'm just a clarion call to everybody and whoever's out there to understand where we're really at. Look at all the money that goes into the hospitals, into the systemic institutions, into the clinics all over the place. Think about all these people who are working with probably your patients, trying to help out and could truly help them out. How can we find a way to keep these people in business?
Yeah. And the same, I would say, goes for these governments spending loads of money, being in loads of debt, wasting so much resource. It seems like we have all the resources, they're simply being allocated in the wrong places, right? And
Yeah.
this is also partly where permaculture comes in, right? Maybe we can merge some of the different solutions together and develop a strategy or plan for action so that way these alternative practitioners can make a living and can actually compete with these institutions because we have unique solutions that I think if people started to find out, they say, whoa, this is a very attractive. So use that to your leverage. Maybe let's bring the influencers together and we can make a really loud statement that can change things rather radically, very
I
quickly.
was I was just on a Twitter space the other day with all doctors, and they were talking about patient care and their frustrations with, they want to provide more, but they can't. And I was just listening in. And basically, what I heard was a doctor was stating, look, I only have so much time. This is my expertise. I'm not an expert in emotional wellness. I don't have the time. I can't provide my patients with what they need. This is actually what I want to do anyway. I don't want to be a therapist. I just want to do the testing and the diagnosing. Okay, okay, let's honor that. Let's understand there are healthcare providers that are solution based. They want to do the tech stuff, the blood testing, whatever technician stuff they're doing. That's their role. We have a solution based model there, emergency based model, but then we have a healing model, and these are other people. And maybe we can work together or collaborate, but we need to open up that if you can't do it all, but you're claiming that you're doing it all, but you realize you can't, well, it's because your one eye shut and you're not seeing all of the millions of people out there who are working so hard in these other realms to support probably your patients. So let's, just focus on if that's what you want to do. You're the solution guy. Great. We need you. And then here's the healing group of people. And can we have a nice relationship and be friends?
Yeah. I will say another thing, we mentioned orgone energy. This relates to chi, to prana, some ideas of the past that are coming to resurface as well. And you'll see that there's even people who talk about using this for other purposes, that if you have a truly open mind for, you'd say, wait, we can change the weather, we can change our skies, and that can potentially affect our health too. Of course, there's also a stigma around dance, right? And using just expressive arts. People who, say, man, well, the only way I know how to unwind and relax and let go is by drinking alcohol, by going partying. And is that really going to open them up to that expression that you guys are talking about where they have this emotional release? Maybe that's where they're trying to find it, but maybe that's not where they have to go, right? Just something I figured to put out there. And then a final note I have is this idea of pleasure, right? For potentially helping us. Well, again, there's nuances to this. For instance, Carl Jung and others who were against some of what Jungian, psychology was about. We're talking about the idea how we should suppress the pleasures and suppress some of our desires because that is what's causing the evil in the world. And you may even see this in some spiritualities in the East of, suppressing material possessions and suppressing your desires. I think Taoism has a unique approach to that, right? They say don't necessarily suppress your desires, recognize them, and just don't let them like become better than you. And so I think there's nuances to this, and I just figured to throw that out there.
Yeah, there's part of the Eastern philosophy that states, the root cause of all suffering is desire. And then you
Mhm.
have a lot of, religions who will say the same thing, right? But we've come to realize that when we repress, suppress, and deny, that shadow aspect is usually going to express itself some way or somehow. And then what we do is we hide, we feel shame, we do things that are extra hedonistic behind the scenes, covertly, we start manipulating, things get worse. It becomes very imbalanced when you deny, suppress, and repress. So how do we find a way to express ourselves in healthy ways, yeah, right? And not deny it and armor ourselves and, do all sorts of weird hedonistic things on the DL, which has to stop.
And I'll just add in the food issue that's related to this that you're talking about, and how food all often becomes a way of trying to deal with those unexpressed desires and urges and seeking pleasure through the taste experience. And food can become such a confusing topic for people and create a lot of hangups, neuroses and mental confusions. But I do think there's a lot of power in the energetics of food, the food quality, and also the rituals of food and eating together as a family or a community, that these are also healing avenues if we approach them in a healthy way.
When you talk about food, Leslie, the denying, suppressing, and the repression, it numbs us eventually to feeling, to our senses. Okay. So then I've seen this countless times, and I've experienced this myself when I'm overworking, I'm imbalanced, I'm not paying attention, I'm disconnected. Sometimes at the end of a long week, I'll say, oh, I would like a little something sweet. I deserve it. It's like somehow your mind is telling you that because of all the hard work you've done, now you deserve a pleasure that maybe you normally wouldn't have. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but when we start grabbing things like drugs, alcohol, really unhealthy food, fast food all the time, a lot of times that food, it's enticing your senses again. It's like, well, that tastes good. I want that because it really tastes delicious. It's because you're kind of out of touch with the senses and the feeling state. You need more to feel more because you're out of touch, kind of thing. When you're more in balance, you can be healthy with maybe a more neutral meal, something healthy, but when you're in balance, I think we start grabbing for things that are extra, to feel that pleasure state.
Yes.
Great points.
Yeah, you guys have a lot of great points here. And even like this quote from the Tao Te Ching says, free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. So it's not that desire within itself is bad, but it perhaps can lead us to not necessarily the greater picture, right? And of course, there's other quotes too from that text that talk about how like all the different senses and all the sensories combined null the senses and makes you really insensitive if it's too much in excess, right? A lot of the teachings are all about balance and coming to that discipline that we have to attain.
It relates a lot to that concept of internal oppression that Stephanie brought up before.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can become a slave to our own addictions, our own patterns of, using pleasure or an external habit to satisfy an emotional need, and get stuck in patterns and cycles of repetition without really getting to the root of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
The
And I hope
first
everybody listening enjoys our, our experiences here and our testimonies. I know we
Mhm.
went quite a bit on this, but, we're very passionate about sharing these solutions.
the first thing is to become aware of it. Again, I think we just are on autopilot. We find ourselves going through the drive-through or just eating normal things, and we normalize eating things that are unhealthy, treating people in not the best ways. We just become unconscious because we go on autopilot. So another aspect of the Eastern style movement towards Taoism and balance is that it asks you to be more present in the moment. So if we could start there to, really help people to understand the importance of 5-minute meditation in the morning or taking time to really be consciously aware, then you can catch yourself before you find yourself in autopilot. I mean, some people live their entire lives that way. They never really come to a full awareness of themselves in the moment, in the experience. So in order for us to do better, we first have to, I think, just stop and really truly allow ourselves to be and feel in the present moment.
It's like you'd think we're not talking about anarchy right now, you know what I mean, or anarchism. But it's funny because we're just talking about returning to our natural senses. I mean, you go back in history, look at Taoism, it's considered the first anarchist philosophy. So if that tells you something right now as the viewer, this term can be seen in different ways, right? And here are people simply saying, hey, it means freedom. It means beyond the ideology, beyond the systems that you've indoctrinated yourself into. we'll explore more too why this term is used, why a psychiatrist would use this as a term as well. I'm sure he doesn't identify with it necessarily. He simply says that's where I stand fundamentally. Right, but it's not something it's like he said too, like he criticized those people. He's not going to be throwing fire on the streets and wearing a mask and saying, I'm here to rebel. He's actually doing something about it. He's actually getting people through a mind-body awareness to get to that point, which he simply sees as like self-evident nature. So, somatherapy is shared in a 50-minute documentary where Cooper traveled to Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, Bahia, and Sao Paulo. The duration of the somatherapy is that it typically lasts about 1.5 years with frequent sessions. Somatherapy includes the classes for that martial arts, study sessions, social activities, and group trips. The group size typically consists of 10 to 15 participants. The sessions are held multiple times a week, each lasting several hours. Participants take on different roles within the group to explore various aspects of their personalities and social interactions. Regular classes focus on developing agility, strength, and coordination. Rituals and music, Leslie mentioned, incorporates traditional music and rituals to create a sense of community and cultural connection. There's also symbolism. The movements and interactions in the martial arts are used as metaphors for personal and social struggles. And there's also exercises from Wilhelm Reich, which includes breathing techniques, body movement, expressive exercises to release emotional blockages, which we just mentioned. Artistic activities, which encourages, artistic expression, painting, writing, theater, improvising, using improvisational techniques to explore and express spontaneously, and community building, right, through the trips. And so basically, participants often report increased self-awareness, emotional resilience, and a sense of empowerment. And so that increases their understanding of social dynamics and their commitment to social justice. Just a summary of the documentary and everything we talked about with somatherapy. So, exercise as an expression of freedom, right? Philosopher Plato said you can learn more about a man in an hour of play than a year of conversation. When I learned about exercise, that's the first quote that came to mind. So I put this there myself. Okay, because I think that is quite telling, right? Like, what did he mean by that? I think this really puts it well. A lack of movement can lead to depression, with the opposite also being true. For example, if we feel bad emotionally or psychologically, we may have a hard time physically supporting other people. The meaning of soma, as said by Hannah Toma, it is the totality of what constitutes the human being. It's the indivisible and non-hierarchical unity of the person's body and mind, genes and environment, emotions, memories, expectations, desires, culture, social behaviors, relationships, and actions that makes up a person at every moment. It's a holistic concept that rejects traditional dualities and dichotomies, which again, parallel you see with the Eastern philosophies as well. Somatherapy, therefore, is in contrast with psychotherapies that deal with only the psyche. According to the principle of irritability, all life forms, from unicellular organisms to animals, react in similar ways to external stimuli. In general, a pleasant or beneficial stimulus, such as a favorable temperature or chemical agent, nourishment, light, etc., causes the organism to expand, whereas a negative stimulus causes the organism to contract. And this, by the way, is where you might see some divergence from Freudian psychology. Okay? You might notice a lot of what we're talking about here is not necessarily considered Freudian. Like, that's why I said it kind of differentiates from Jungian. But of course, we can learn from all of these. Just understand that this idea of pleasure and desire, to what extent, right? I would ask you guys more questions among these lines. I mean, look at the top websites that people visit in this world. You guys know what they are, right? I think there is an overstimulation that can happen and over perversion, sexualization that happens in our world of people seeking pleasure, but not necessarily through the right means, right? There's a lot of dopamine hits. There's a lot of addiction in our society. We talked about that.
Yeah, I mean, Corey, are we talking about pornography addiction here?
Yes.
Probably should bring it up because
Yes.
I mean, I'm not an expert, but I do know men who actually do courses to help other men overcome their pornography addiction. And I haven't been in any of those courses, but the gist of it I hear is that there's a need to connect, a need to feel intimacy,
Mm.
and men can find intimacy pretty quickly through sex, right? And doing it through a screen allows you to get that hit of dopamine, that intimacy that you need without participating.
Mhm.
So, but I can imagine between video games and porn and just the computer in general, we need to reroute our energy, and the other thing too is I don't want to get into any sort of like sacred sexuality. I know this is an on all ages show, but that stuff is very sacred,
Mhm.
and to just waste it frivolously is not the best way to go. I mean, it's very sacred. It's very creative. It's our creative life force. It's the seed of our creativity. So I think we just need the education and to be able to channel it appropriately. And if we can't channel it appropriately, let's address why.
Mhm.
And also looking at the way that like pornography really disconnects people from their real life relationships and from the ability to connect intimately with the people in their actual lives. There's actual harm done to that with the excessive use.
Mhm.
Well, they've discovered it changes your brain, literally changes your brain. So is that direction? I mean, it's so strange how in the era of all this technocracy and tech is that, the next big thing coming out of China is sex dolls.
Mhm.
It's another addiction,
Yeah.
It's
any
another
addiction
way
really
to,
will change your brain.
Yeah, it's something we have to address, just to put out there. Like,
yeah.
it is, like I said, very out common, and people have, again, stigmas talking about all the things we're talking about here in the seminar. So I'm not afraid to talk about these things.
The objectification of women or the objectification of bodies in general, devoid of a soul.
Hmm.
Again, it's hard work to be a human and to participate fully in your humanness. It's not easy. It's the right thing to do, right? So I think we need to be mindful. There's a storm a coming that's providing everything you need to be detached from your soul,
Hmm.
you know?
I would point men and maybe even women to Taoist, Taoist, Taoist sexual technique and um, books on that subject because we don't really have much for a model in that area. It's been a very taboo subject for very long. It hasn't been developed very well. We alluded to it in the Reichian therapy that that tends to get to it in the body, the tension that's stored in the body. But for a man, the Taoist sexual technique learned and practiced can be very helpful. And because not only as a practice, but because it helps you get an understanding of the energy flow. It's related to and connected into the Kundalini. And so it's part of the chakras and it's a very important one to address. So yeah, so all these things are very good points, and that is where I would look if you are looking for some help on it. I've done work with other men in therapy on this and have developed some things, but I think ultimately understanding and having your own technique, which is given to you uh, in that therapy, Taoist sexual technique.
I
Thank
think
you for
this is a
sharing.
much larger issue that we're not going to get into, but I'm really connecting the dots now based off of what Scott was just saying in regards to if we want to contribute to a better, more conscious, more self-aware and interconnected society, we have to have the education and the ability to commit to overcoming our lower nature.
Hmm.
And again, we are connected to everything at the blink of an eye, the touch of your hand, to a world that's going to disconnect you to stay from your higher nature and to keep you stuck in your lower nature. And again, we see
Sure.
this normalized. We see this normalized with adult human beings talking like they're children in an adult body regarding their sexuality. It's very tough. I
Wow.
think this is a clarion call for anyone out there. We need more work. We need more true sex education to help people overcome this, because like Scott said, the chakras, we're talking chakra 1 and 2. These are the base. This is the lowest level of human consciousness, right?
And these are where we have our barriers. A lot of people never overcome. We were talking about food, which very much relates to the first chakra, bodily survival. Talking about sex, which is the second chakra. And if there's any disorders in those two areas, which are very common, people are not getting up to the awareness of group, awareness of others, empathy for others, those kind of things. We're living in society that through the propaganda and advertising media and news media are kind of keeping people in general in these lower chakras and getting people addicted in these areas. You can be addicted to sex, can be addicted to food. Drugs is another variety of food. It's something the body has taken in for some kind of energy exchange. And that's how they work. And so these lower two areas are essential to get past in order to even become, shall we say, human. It's an initiation into the world of humanity where we start making a difference with each other and exchanging with each other. When people are down here at the bottom, trying to get past things that prevent them from connecting to others, then they're essentially out of play, out of the game. And that's a tragedy. But they present themselves for help in the medical profession. They're the ones who are usually have illness and injury. And so being helped out of that condition can open up the door.
Interesting.
A friend of mine.
Also related to the, I'm sorry, Steph.
No, go ahead, Leslie, go ahead.
Also related to the first chakra are our basic security needs, our sense of safety, and having our rootedness in, our practical life needs, food, shelter, clothing. And when economically we are hurting, that is disrupting also that those lower chakras, those energy expressions. And this second chakra also related to creativity, that is like the opposite side of the kind of compulsivity that is related to the lack of security. So when we look at the healthcare field, when someone is sick or they're afraid of dying, that is going to certainly challenge and stress those lower chakras, and potentially imbalance and lead someone to be grasping, a bit more desperate for some kind of help or relief, right?
Mhm.
I was just going to quickly add, for any of our audience who doesn't know what the chakra system is, it is an ancient energetic mapping system of our body. There's 7 traditional chakras, from the root or the base of the spine to the crown of the head. And what we're referring to here is that the majority of society, as far as we've known it up to this point, has been living and circulating in the bottom 3, or what we would refer to as the lower nature chakras. Like Leslie said, the first one is about your survival, security, food, relationship to your mother, how you feel. Do you feel safe in this world? Are you grounded? Second one is the sexual chakra, the ability to go with the flow and to be malleable and to evolve and to move and flow with life, related to all of the fluid systems within the body. The third chakra would be the seat of personal transformation and evolution, the ability to go through a transformative process to start to awaken to your true self, right? So we could say the next chakra is the heart chakra, right? The fourth one is the heart. The fifth is the throat, to be able to speak your truth. The fifth is the third eye, to tap into higher potential. And then you've got your crown chakra. So if we're stuck in our lower nature, the first 3, we haven't even yet penetrated into the heart chakra, which is the ability to get in touch with our relationships and the collective consciousness and to have this unifying principle of being more of a of understanding, loving human. So to me, I see this as this space between the third chakra and the heart chakra is this pivotal place. It's like a steel door that we need to really break through to get into the heart, to have this heart awakening. It's almost like, to me, it feels like the I was going to say the firmament is like the space beyond the matrix. It's like, in order to break beyond the matrix, you got to be able to go from the seat of your own personal transformation and your initiation, and you got to break through that into your heart and really open and awaken the center of your heart. So this is where all potentials reside. And society and systematically keeping us locked out of that heart into the matrix, addicted in the lower three chakras, are, I would say, the contributing factor to all of the problems that we have that keep just repeating in the world. So we have to fight
Yes.
against this entropy and wake up and find the others who can help you to overcome this lower nature.
Yes. I will say there's also many words, many descriptions for what you mentioned are chakras in other cultures. Like in China, they call it the dantians, right? And of course, we talked about Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. Well, it's pretty much the same as, the chakra system. And you could even look at David Hawkins and his scales of consciousness, and it's very similar. So there's a lot of parallels within people's works. And also, when we mention freedom, it's like, what type of freedom are we talking about? Are we talking about a freedom which includes, like, just doing whatever we want, engaging in all the desires that we want, or a freedom that's actually higher mind and based on order, right? I mean, people can assume freedom by definition just means doing whatever you want. And that's where I think anarchy gets the bad reputation that it gets. But of course, the perspective we're sharing here is rather very different. And, you look at, a philosophical anarchism, and it's about the idea that we're actually creating the most amount of order, but yet the most amount of freedom. And so asking ourselves, like, how is that possible? Maybe it has to do a lot more with psychology than we think.
The mentality of freedom as, I'm comfortable, my family's comfortable, I got what I need, and I have my own luxury in life. This ain't it. This is not what we're talking about. This is not where we're headed, right?
Mhm.
So moving through into higher state of consciousness involves everyone and everything around you. You take into account another as an extension of yourself, right? So if you're in that mentality of me and my own are okay, there's some work to do.
And so, more on this, Dr. Frederick Perls, a precursor of Gestalt therapy, which we'll be touching on, sustained the fundamental significance of living perceptually alert to the present moment. Perls believed that the unmediated perception through the senses allows the spontaneous and natural mechanism of self-regulation. Rational abstraction prevents this spontaneity from occurring and creates another mechanism that is alienation and self-censorship through acceptance of external values and judgments coming from the family, society, etc., which are settled in the conscious and unconscious. For authoritarian individuals, it is common to have a physical armoring that develops characterized by a tightening and constricting the musculature, which we talked about. It is apparently a natural defense mechanism of self-protection when living under a prolonged state of oppression or repression. The main characteristic of play is that it's free and it is in fact freedom. And I love that quote. And of course, this comes from several studies. Okay, so this idea of play, very simple, very fundamental. We do it as kids. Are we upholding that in practice in our lives? Something to bear in mind. How healing is it? How connecting is it? And so,
And
just,
how
yeah,
unrecognized the value is of play in
yeah.
our school systems and in our workplaces. Play is not being recognized as having the importance that it actually has, especially for the healthy development of children.
Hmm.
And what I notice in my practice, my psychotherapy practice, is a really high number of people struggling with overthinking,
Yeah.
rumination, perseverating on thoughts, repeating obsessively problems and trying to solve problems with their minds.
Mhm.
And it only escalates into more frustration and doesn't actually solve the problems. It's an irony, and this aspect of coming back to the body, coming into finding a place of playfulness, curiosity, as you mentioned before, and creativity and compassion and connectedness, these qualities that bring us to a place of that equanimity or the balance that the Taoists talk about, where you can let go of that armoring and the rigidity and discharge energy and move and metabolize emotion. It's
Mhm.
absolutely necessary,
Mhm.
from my point of view. And
And for
people do
anybody
a lot of
listening,
coaching.
tell us if we're wrong. Tell us if there's a perspective we're not seeing here. We're trying to get the bigger picture. And, are we overthinking it? I mean, here's the deal, right? Are you overthinking it? What's going on here? And I have a question for you guys, right? Where does this overthinking come from? What chakra is this, right? Because if we're thinking, we might associate that with a higher chakra, but we said before, no, this is like our higher mind. So is that really thinking?
So the internal family systems model does a really good job, I think, of kind of defining our internal or psychological parts and how they develop. So you could think of overthinking or rationalizing or problem solving, critical thinking as a part of our mind that has kind of become more compartmentalized and separated from the rest of our system. And it goes on overdrive. It goes on that excessive path because of unresolved trauma and wounding that's underneath it, that has been unresolved and unhealed. And the pain of that becomes unbearable to the system, and that part just sort of mushrooms up to try to solve the problem, but it lacks the bigger picture of your system and what's going on in the world. Sometimes is even stuck at a younger age in how it operates. So that is a particular modality that I find very helpful in starting to map out our own minds and to start to see what parts of us are working too hard, what has become excessive and out of balance, and then finding means to bring yourself back into balance.
I would agree that that's where you get a model for where, which voices are saying what and needing what kind of thing. I would say that going a little bit deeper, I think the root of the persistent voices, the spinning around in your head kind of a thing, is in communication itself. You have interrupted communications. And of course, trauma is one of the biggest interrupters of communication. Trauma can actually interrupt your life for quite a while if you're injured. Um, it can interrupt your dreams and goals if you've been shot down by somebody who's very suppressive. And so you have what we call an incomplete communication. And incomplete communications scream at us through the mind and through these, not directly. It's almost like a dreamlike state. It may be converted into something like she was pointing out, a family arrangement of different needs or different levels of self that are crying out. But in general, I would say just that principle of incomplete cycles of communication are trying to complete. And oftentimes this is why talk therapy is so effective, is because you finally have someone to talk to, you get it out, it doesn't bother or afflict you anymore. And if it does persist, there's something even deeper, and that, I would look to some kind of trauma therapy. But oftentimes people really don't have someone to talk to, or if they do, that someone's not necessarily listening well with good acknowledgments, and you're not getting that communication completed. So it's going to continue going around and round until it finally reaches its resolution.
Yeah, that's great, Scott. And it also can reflect an incomplete like you said, processing of the trauma. So that relates to some of the somatic work of being stuck without the completion of your fight or flight response. And that gets held in the body, but then can be kind of deflected into the mind, right? So again, it brings us back to the body also being a mechanism to complete that incomplete process of trying to seek safety and find safety. Yeah.
I just want to share two things real quick. This is a really good book called We All Have Parts. And this was recommended by a friend who we all know, Colin. And it's a really great beginner way to take the internal family systems approach. It's almost like a children's book. Coming from my background, which is more of this spiritual yogic background, part of this we would call the monkey mind, right? So part of the somatic approach, or more of the Eastern style approach with dealing with this, would to be first be able to sit still, and to sit still until the monkey mind starts to quiet down, right? So one of the phrases we were taught was, you should meditate for 20 minutes each day. And if you don't have time for that because you think you're too busy, then meditate for an hour each day, right? So it was this idea of just sitting in the discomfort of stillness until you start to starve a little bit of that energy, and just sit and sit and sit until it starts to discharge. But what I'm really coming to realize is that I believe we are at an absolute and complete convergence, is that as far as assessment with anybody who is suffering from a physical or mental illness, I think if we could come up with a very clear assessment plan on to see whether or not this person would first benefit from soma therapy or cognitive therapy, and then most likely at some point you're going to have to switch. And maybe it's a game of switching back and forth until you feel the reclamation of your own safety. But I think right now, if you're looking at the normal traditional Western medical model, is everybody gets the same assessment, which is not very good.
Right.
Did your mother have a heart attack? I mean, it's like, we're not really understanding, I don't think, on a not just metaphysical level, but on a truly physical level, the capacity of what this body can do. And I think if we could find that way to work together between the mind and the body, I think that physically we can make a profound difference in our state of disease.
Yeah. I see often people are like, oh, it's genetics. Oh, it's age. They jump to these different things. And I kind of laugh because it's like, I mean, there's clearly causal things that happen that you can like trace down to find out what is really going on. And there's people who defy that very easily. There's people in their 80s and 90s, hundreds who look healthy. Like G. Edward Griffin's a good example. If you know who he is, he's a researcher online. He popularized the idea of B17. I'm pretty sure everybody watching by now has an open mind to new information. So, if you're interested, I mean, his work is amazing. You can find recordings of him in the 60s. He looks like he's in his 50s right now. He's in his 90s.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just incredible, right? Because people, like you're right, they definitely put themselves down and they don't have to do that. And again, going back to rational abstraction, we see that as a parallel with what Jung was talking about before. We started a lot of this out with his work. Something important just to know about is this idea of nonviolent communication. Of course, we're talking about hierarchy, we're talking about coming together, we're talking about community, we're talking about how do we deal with our problems effectively. Well, we have to be nice to ourselves and be nice to others, right? But at the same time, we want to open up. We want to find out our true selves. I mean, this is just one chart that goes over numerous different things about nonviolent communication, which is NVC. So you can pause and check that out if you want. You might find better information online if you want to delve into this, but it's just something to bear in mind. And here's like a summary of it: observation, feelings, needs, and request. Can we open up about our feelings? And maybe, when it comes to politics, can we open up about our views without getting violent, without getting emotional, without saying, I'm right, you're wrong? And you can see the world as most of us know it: interpretation, judgment, no connection, strategy, and demand. But the non-violent communication world is observation, feelings, looking at our needs and request, asking questions, right? Going back to that dialogical method.
It strikes me that this would be a helpful approach for someone to prepare to go to the doctor. That you can sit and you can do some internal reflection, you can observe and describe the situation as non-judgmentally as possible, right? And express your feelings without criticizing the doctor or the system, to define your needs and express them, and then to politely, make a request, and maybe in mass, the more of us that do this could be of help, in highlighting what's going on in what's disconnected in the medical system.
Yeah.
And making a request is an action as well. And I think a lot of people are afraid. I have clients who have told me that they are afraid to really appear to be critical of their medical provider. They are afraid to really ask for things for fear of the doctor being mad at them or feeling criticized, and then it somehow coming back on them. So I think that for some people, well, for many people, the communication skills are not, they're not confident in them. They're not comfortable. And so instead we get this sort of buildup of repressed, held on to emotions, and then you get your trigger and then you burst out angrily, and that doesn't really help solve the problem, or doesn't help you get your needs met.
I want to add on to what Leslie is saying is communication takes two. And the way the system has operated up until this point is that, I forget the term, but the languaging, the complicated languaging, is it legalese court? The complicated languaging that the provider is using doesn't make it easy for the patient to communicate efficiently. I mean, again, we already talked about the roles of the dynamics of the white coat and the patient, or the victim and the savior mentality. So there's some nuances I think that we need to be present with. And I think this could be used on both sides, because this might help the doctor and the provider to remember their humanness, because they're very much on autopilot when they go in there with only 15 minutes to see their patient. So if both can be meeting each other and reminding themselves of their humanness in the interaction, then we have a one-on-one relational communication where two people are meeting more as equals with different skills than in this relationship of role setting. And the other thing I just wanted to mention with this NVC, which may be a little bit of a potential red flag or proclivity to take something too far, which I think is really relevant in our society today, is that when somebody has been oppressed or suppressed in a way, and they come to consciousness of it, sometimes that person can wake up to feel angry, right? Usually they say the truth will set you free, but it makes you're pissed off at first. You get angry at first, right? Yeah. So in that first initial state of awakening, the tendency is to become hyper extreme in your response. Usually somebody who awakens and is angry doesn't hit that neutral middle point of proper communication and effective communication immediately. Usually there's a demand for more now, because I've woken up to that I'm suppressed. So now I demand, you owe me this, and the government owes me this, and now I'm a victim. And now you go too far when you're in that angry state. So I think it's complicated. You don't want to have nonviolent communication to the degree where we're catering to somebody's trauma who doesn't want to move beyond it. I think that's just a nuance. And you can see why breaking out of this matrix of doing things outside of the realm that we have done them in requires nuance. And it's not easy. Because again, you can just say, oh, we need to have nonviolent communication, but then we're always going to have the person who wants to remain the victim and is going to say, well, you're not talking to me kindly because this is a nonviolent communication situation. Well, now we've missed the mark again. Now we've gone too far in the other direction. So I think in terms of our healing process, especially with things like this, We have to constantly have that map of what is it, what's balance. And balance is our opportunity to overcome and transform and take self responsibility, but also get the help that we need. I think we have to really clearly define, what does that look like? What are we aiming for? What are we aiming towards? And then find our way along that chart so we can, again, get what we need, because there are real victims that exist and people that need help. How do we get what we need, but then also encourage the self responsibility to transform and to evolve? Because most often that is possible. For a few, it's not, but most it is possible.
I find it fascinating that, we're going from the medical system to the political system to the medical system. It's like, because if you think about it, the politician is like the doctor for the world. And there's patients, there's victims, there's people who say, "Man, I need help. I need help. Could we change society? Could we change the way we're doing things?" And I think it's fascinating that we're making this connection, because this connection just within itself is not often being made. So I just want to bring our present awareness to that fact again, because we see this dynamic of the masculine and feminine at play in all aspects of our society.
And I think it's important that we use communication and nonviolent communication in some form, not necessarily following this particular man's model, but to use communication and kind of mature attempts at problem solving to start,
Hmm.
right? To start, to approach people in our lives as being worthy of that type of treatment. And then from there, if we reach an impasse, then there's another level, another step, right?
Hmm.
What do we do next?
Right.
And maybe that's something we'll talk about more as we go.
Yeah, when you take a higher perspective, when you've done your own work and you've started to overcome your own traumas and have broken through your lower nature and are committed to living in that holistic vision of love, is that, again, you start to see everybody as an extension of you, which means that everybody deserves love to start before the problem. You deserve to be seen as a human and loved just as one of my own. If that can come first, rather than seeing someone as separate from ourselves, that would change the game. It's taking a top down approach, a spiritual approach, and then working its way down the layers, rather than taking the lower nature approach. And then maybe we see a higher reality, now that we're in a meaning crisis later. Why can't we make the meaning first? Why can't we make the love first? Why can't we make the connection first and then work our way down? See, now all of a sudden we have geniuses saying that we're in a meaning crisis because we've done everything down here, and now we're getting to the top saying, what did we do all that for? So I think that the ask is, it's the pole shift. Can we invert and start to see society as a top down? And when I say top down, I don't mean hierarchical. I mean spiritual and love based first.
Right. Yeah, good point. Very good point. So let's talk about this idea of anarchism or being a rebel, because these two terms may go hand in hand. And if you've reached this point in a seminar, you may be curious about this idea of anarchy. Well, Emma Goldman, who's known as a notorious anarchist in America, wrote something called The Psychology of Political Violence. So it's very interesting to see people in the political realm starting to talk about psychology just as much as the people in the health field talking about politics and then relating that to psychology. Maybe there is some interlinking here that could be found, since we are indeed challenging a lot of different authoritarian dynamics, hierarchical dynamics. Is all hierarchy bad? Is all government bad? Or all these medical systems bad? Well, we need to be able to decipher and discern and look at the nuances of this. Okay, so thank you, for having an open mind, and let's learn about this perspective, because anarchists or rebels could be blamed for the problems that they speak against. And we have to ask ourselves why. So Emma Goldman says, compared with the wholesale violence of capital and government, political acts of violence are but a drop in the ocean. That so few resist is the strongest proof how terrible must be the conflict between their souls and unbearable social iniquities. And so, if we're going to understand this, actually, there was a psychologist, Dennis Fox, who really delved deep into this subject of anarchism. And he acknowledged that not many people have done this from the psychology perspective. He notes that there are practically no books on anarchism and psychology, and the two barely get interlinked, though important. Okay, he says the state is a condition, a certain relationship between human beings, a mode of human behavior. We destroy it by contracting other relationships, by behaving differently. He uses that quote from Landier. Another quote he says is, people do not live in the state lives in the people. So this is a very different view, right, of anarchism right off the bat. It's like, wait, the state is within people. We're talking about this idea of statism, a belief system that takes place in many individuals. So maybe it's not this external thing we attack and get rid of and say, this is the problem. We need to get rid of this. Maybe we have to start looking more inward. Well, we're talking about a lot of those solutions are rather very different, and our approach is rather very different than what we are tending to look at for changing our world. He says, quote, the problem that confronts us today, and which the nearest future is to solve, is how to be oneself and yet in one's oneness with others, to deeply feel with all human beings and still retain one's characteristic qualities. How do we have this relationship between upholding ourselves, our authentic individual self, and still being part of society, still being part of the collective or working well together with others and creating different organizations or business structures? How can we bridge that balance where we can create a medical system or a system of healing for people, but without crowding out that individual and still recognizing the individual for who they are? And their value and perhaps how they react individually to certain foods or medications. It's a tricky balance. And if you're at this point in the seminar, you see this as a constant conflict, right? We talked about the masculine and the feminine, all these different forms of balances. Well, how do we navigate that? And so Dennis Fox tells us the problem of psychologists. He says, I'm not ignoring psychologists' roles as enforcers of conventional Western middle class values and agents of state and corporate power. It's a sordid history from intelligence and personality testing that categorizes people for bureaucratic social control to pacifying prisoners, workers, mental patients, students, and women to psychological manipulation ranging from spreading distorted models of normality to advertising corporate products to interrogating prisoners at Guatemala Bay. Psychotherapists routinely use medicalized diagnoses created by psychiatrists, demanded by insurance companies, and sometimes designed explicitly for social control. He says oppositional defiant disorder, for example, stems from the diagnosis of anarchia that Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, applied to resistors to federal authority whose excess of the passion for liberty constituted a form of insanity. So we talked about in the very beginning of this seminar, to kind of bring things to full circle, this idea of labeling an illness, creating a diagnosis. Well, here Benjamin Rush, the father of American psychiatry, is making anarchia this label for somebody who has this excess passion for liberty, and he calls it a form of insanity. So isn't that very interesting? And of course, he gives a bunch of examples here of how there's this interesting history behind psychology that many psychologists may not want to look at, right? So we have to acknowledge our own faults before we can move forward and recognize what we can do better. And so he expands on this greatly in many sources. He says early women anarchists insisted that changes in personal aspects of life, such as families, children, sex, should be viewed as political activity. A century later, Milstein says anarchism, the only political tradition that has consistently grappled with the tension between the individual and society, aims to transform society in order to also transform ourselves. Anarchism may still have more to offer psychology than the other way around. Social psychologists make a mantra of the interaction between the person or the personality, emotion, beliefs, and the setting, the presence of others, the configuration of a room, perceived norms, although mainstream views of setting typically exclude society, culture, and history. He recognizes many spiritual and environmentalist connections to anarchism, which include non-institutional religions, Zen, Taoism, Native Americans, shamanism, etc. He says many of us would be more effective anarchists as well as more fulfilled human beings if we could counter our culturally determined everyday psychology. So again, very different view of anarchism, bringing in now Zen, Taoism, different ancient cultures and religions that actually were upholding these very similar positions. Again, if you go to many historians on the topic of Taoism, as I have in my book on Taoism, you'll see this as a common trend as well. We even talked about, again, the masculine and feminine is a concept within the yin yang symbol, which comes from Taoism. So there's a very interesting connections to be made there. You'll see among promoters of Zen, people like Osho and Alan Watts, who also talk about how nature is fundamentally politically anarchy. And Osho would go on and say, well, wait, this anarchy is very different and that he's not like other anarchists. And he accepted that label, but he said that, what we need to do is transform the individual and that politics is of the ego. And it's not really of a place for somebody like him or anybody else to really engage with because it's not one where you actually authentically want to change society or the individual. It's one where you're saying, I want this position of authority and I need to do violence to others. They understood it from a psychology point of view, which I thought was quite interesting. You can look into that more if you would like. But as this is a whole different perspective, a whole different rabbit hole to go down. And so we're healing not just the individual, right? This is a common trend we're seeing as well. We talked about before. He says 20th century psychologists who eventually became therapists encouraged people to fix themselves rather than challenge bosses, political elites, or dominant institutions more broadly. And still today, mainstream therapy helps us function, boosting our confidence and self-esteem and maintaining our relationships so that we can get through school, get to work on time, keep it at one day after the next, mastering stress reduction techniques and ignoring any inkling that something outside ourselves might be at fault, even when millions of us have identified identical individual problems. He says paying more attention to the personal and interpersonal also means responding to those who experience mental or emotional distress. We know that they, perhaps we, often struggle in psychiatric systems that are overworked, bureaucratized, medicalized, disinterested, and often inadequate at best. Yet this struggle also takes place with friends and comrades. Dorder pointed out that although psychiatric survivor movements ask fundamental questions of what it means to be mad in an insane world, questions of mental health and mad liberation figure little into the work that anarchists collectively focus on or in the ways we structure ourselves or organize. So there's a lot of bridges to be made here between people who want freedom, people who care about health, people who want to heal themselves, the doctors who want to heal their patients. Um, there is a lot of interlinking to be made here. What do you guys think on what has been said so far on this matter in this tricky balance of the individual and society?
I think one thing that comes up for me again is going back to the whole yin yang, masculine, feminine, and the components within ourselves that want to take action and change and create revolution, with the other aspects of ourselves that want to enjoy the being within life. And that these two forces do create an inner duality or war within us. So one thing that you're, reading here is the external reality has to change and shift if we do the self work, right? If people start to evolve, the environment will have to reflect that evolution. And it's a big task because systems are very concretized and they're large and they run as best as they can run to suit the public. I think that what I'm feeling here from my gut is that there's a lot of fear at the top of the institutional level of what happens if this does collapse? What do we do? Is it going to be the end of the world? And I'd like to see a little more leaning into personal trust so that then maybe can actually trust and create what comes next.
Mhm. Yes, changing the way we change and looking at the problems of, ourselves, but then looking at the problems as well within the systems, not just the individuals. And so he calls a lot of this idea false consciousness about injustice. He says false consciousness has been defined as the holding of false or inaccurate beliefs that are contrary to one's own social interest and which thereby contribute to the maintenance of the disadvantaged position of the self or the group. More pointedly, people accept the status quo out of lack of awareness that viable alternatives exist, and out of ignorance as to how their rulers are violating their professed interest, or out of ignorance of how they themselves are being harmed by what they think are their interests. So again, there's this deception that takes place, like statism. It's like, oh, I want this person to be in this position of authority. They'll do good. Of course, we change the system. We can put in all these good things in our view, and we think it's for our interest, or we think somebody's serving our interest. We may be deceiving ourselves and causing the most amount of death possible through, democide and statism, what we're talking about. And he quotes many different researchers in this article. He says that unless individuals become reasonably aware of the ideological deception of which they are victims, it is unlikely that they will be able to engage in any process of social change. Many people are falling to different ideologies, different ways of thinking. And the anarchist point of view is saying, what if we can do away with these different forms of ideologies? And maybe we have an ideology ourselves, but we're not accepting that position of authority. We're not imposing on others using government. We're practicing it perhaps voluntarily, right? We're approaching things consciously. It's not a false consciousness here. And so he says there's categories of false consciousness, the failure to perceive justice and disadvantage. Uh, People frequently perceive situations to be fair or just even when there are good reasons to suppose that such situations are not. Fatalism, which includes the belief that protest is futile, embarrassing, or exhausting, and the justification of social roles as through person perception and stereotyping. False attribution of blame, including self-blame and false other blame, identification with the aggressor, which includes psychological dependence and preference for the outgroup, and resistance to change, taking into account both cognitive and behavioral conservatism. So there's different factors here. False attribution of blame, identification with the aggressor, resistance to change, the justification of social roles. We talked about the problem of, assuming that victimhood mentality as well as the imbalanced other perspective of, wanting to be the dominator. And so we're trying to still navigate this through other ways of looking at it. And so approaching consciously. Todd Sloan claimed that while the emancipatory interest is relatively inoperative in mainstream psychology, it is this interest that the general public expects the field to serve. He added, people do not need a set of universal principles or laws of behavior. Instead, people need to be invited by psychologists and other social scientists to participate in an ongoing process of reflection on our personal and collective problems in living meaningfully. As psychologists, we ourselves need to reflect on the possible forms of the good life in the good society. Because every approach to psychology incorporates its own values, assumptions, and practices, as well as its own benefits and risks. It is all the more important to choose our approach consciously rather than find ourselves immersed in one by default. Right? You go to school, you learn a certain way, certain practice, you don't necessarily learn all the alternatives. Right? And then what happens when people do learn those alternatives? We know, as we talked about before, those people may be seen as the outcasts, the rebels, and how are they treated, as opposed to these folks who just go along with things and go with the flow. So it's very important to understand here because if you choose to be a big rebel and say, oh, this whole system is wrong, you might be called an anarchist. You might be called somebody who is insane, where they may have to put a label on you. And are we doing that to our fellow men who actually cares really deeply about our world and wants to approach it more consciously, not less.
Hey, Corey, I just wanted to add in that it's very difficult, no matter how much knowledge or education you gain, to be able to truly see another's experience if you haven't experienced the depth or close to the depth at which that experiencer has lived their personal subjective experience. So, how could somebody actually even see at a level of a scientist or PhD or doctor? How could they really truly see besides what the patient is reflecting back, or the consumer or the client or the patient is reflecting back to the doctor, which would mean that the patient would have a responsibility to be radically honest. But if the patient is disempowered, often they can't be radically honest. And if they are radically honest and they are somehow outgrowing the experience or knowledge of the provider, then things become hazy, and maybe you're shamed or now worried that they're delusional, because now you've gone outside of the realm of what the professional is aware of or is safe dealing with. So it's very difficult. I think a rebel is created by an experience someone has had that nobody has been able to touch the level of experience for them to get the help that they need. But then it can't be seen by the provider. So it's very difficult.
Yes.
I find it very interesting that quote here, people do not need a set of universal principles or laws. Instead, people need to be invited to participate in an ongoing process of reflection and collective problem solving, right? And I think that when we're talking about this word anarchy, where it brings up fear is this idea of, chaos and external attack or people turning on you, right? But really what it's implying is that we are doing, each of us on our own individual basis, our internal reflection and deeply understanding causes, for what's happening, and taking responsibility for our own healing and our own cooperative problem solving. And it's really talking about the superficiality or the limited benefit of just someone imposing a solution on you, right? Telling you what you should do, what is right or what is wrong, as opposed to guiding you through a process of discovering that much deeper, much more long lasting, much more akin to something that we might call healing. And the solutions can be better for all of us if we all take that individual responsibility and work together from a place of care and cooperation.
I want to add, Leslie, real quick, is that we have come to a point in society where patients, certain patients, not all patients, again, we need some nuance, have done a massive degree of inner work along their journey, especially people are living longer. You might have people living with chronic illness, such as myself, for many, many, many years. They've been able to move or shift out of the survival mode to be able to be more intellectually introspective about their journey. And what is happening is we are having people, human beings, who are considered or classified patients that are outgrowing the knowledge and experience of the professional. That's what's happening. And we need to be able to safely identify those individuals honestly. And then for a provider to say, just like when I was a yoga teacher, right? I may be a generalist, but I have my own specialties. So if I would have a client come to me and say, I want to become flexible, learn the practice of yoga, but I'm also a triathlete, I had the grace and honesty and confidence within myself to say, I can teach you yoga perfectly. But if you want to get the experience of using yoga for your athleticism, I suggest you go to Laurel down the street, because she's going to be able to even give you a little bit more of that nuance that's going to plug right into exactly where you're at. So this is where we're at. There are going to have to be professionals who think that they know everything, who are coming in contact with clients who say, you know what? This is outgrowing my ability to serve you. And I can help you in certain ways, but I want to try to find someone else who may be able to plug into your situation a little more closely, who can maybe take you to that next step.
You're pointing to the fact that we need more flexibility, right, in how the medical system approaches people as individuals and their needs. And I think that most people who are reaching out to the medical system um, are really looking for guidance, for help, right, and are functioning within this existing structure. And yet, through that process of healing, one typically recognizing that the structure that we're living in is part of the cause of our problem, ultimately coming down to stress and limitation. And so when we're thinking of as patients, as we all start to do our own inner awakening to our needs and the way that the system and the statism itself is causing more problems for us or capping our growth and healing, we need to have these conversations, right? And these opportunities to find new flexible ways of referring people, right, on a simple level, ways of referring people out or expanding the options for care.
Right.
In the future, I perceive there to be a much higher level of resonance between patients and providers. There's no provider going to claim that they can truly take someone to maybe that deeper healing. I think right now we don't have much choice. And I think as time proceeds, we're going to get more cued in, just like the internet, just like social media. It's already happening, is that people are attracted to certain people or healers online because there's a resonance. There is a vibrational frequency that makes somebody be attracted to somebody, right? So I think that same thing, if permitted, will actually be able to happen in medicine where you don't just have one doctor and you have no choice. It's literally the patient can say, this is who I resonate with the most. And they can create more of a closer relationship that's more of a physician guide along with their patient, where the relationship dynamic is different. It's not the hierarchy. It's not, well, this is who you get. It's the patient has more ability to say, or we can say as professionals, can say to our patients, these are your options. Who do you resonate with? Who do you think you could go furthest with? And
And
to let
create an
that
individualized treatment plan.
exactly. I mean, I think that how we've done it can take people so far. And now a lot of people are keeping people stuck in the dynamics of the proxy parents because we're not willing and open to the flexibility to say, you know what, I don't think I can take this, a professional to say, I don't think I can take this person any further. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Johnny down the hall, do you think, does this resonate with you? And really to get to take the person a little bit further, I think we're keeping people stuck the way that we're doing it and blaming the patients and just saying, oh, the patients are disempowered. It's their fault. Well, maybe the providers are contributing to keeping them stuck as well.
Right.
So I think we have to look at it from all angles.
Sloan says here that the general public expects the field to serve emancipatory interest, to serve freedom. And yet, mainstream psychology is not necessarily looking at the freedom that, we're talking about right now. But we gave an example before of somatherapy, which was a therapy designed to do that, to provide freedom in people. And you see a whole documentary of testimonies of people saying, wow, I never felt like this before. I feel more connected to these people in the therapy than my own family and friends. And that's incredible. And something I think to help navigate this idea of the external and the internal, or do we treat the individual or do we treat society, is what Mark Passio says, and we talked about him before, with the idea of the internal monarchy and the external anarchy, right? Which is controlling ourselves but not controlling another. So we know that we can heal the system by allowing people to be free, but we can heal the individual by allowing them to have ownership over themselves. So we're still looking at an individual, but we're also healing the whole by simply knowing where to have our own boundaries, right? Where to set the limits of, of control. Like I control myself, but I don't control another. Like that's a principle that we apply for ourselves. So he says people do not need a set of universal principles or laws of behavior, but people do need to recognize reflection and collective problems and living meaningfully. We still are gathering some sense of principle throughout this process. whether we recognize it or not. It's how we apply it. Like freedom itself, we can say is a principle, even though we may say it's not any particular principle or way of doing things, because it allows people to choose their own principles or allows people to pursue their own principles. I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah, I think there, just to add what you said, Corey, real quick, is when we say allow people to choose their own principles,
Hmm.
there has to be a little bit of understanding that we don't mean let's go to the circus and be completely delusional like
Hmm.
we see in society. We've gone way too far
Right,
out of anything that's natural and holistic,
right.
and it's become very selfish and materialistic. And I don't have to work on myself because I'm perfect as I am. So it's one of those things that, please understand, who's ever watching, when we're saying these things and your mind goes to, oh, that's, what do you mean? Do anything we want? That's not what we're saying. We're actually referring to coming back into a little bit more of balance with nature and each other and ourselves as a whole.
Hmm. In fact, yeah, and we would argue that you can't have freedom or true freedom or lasting sustainable freedom unless you have that self-control and that's that conscience to recognize what you can and can't do in many ways, right? So that is important, and it's something that we tend to go on about here, which is why I think psychology is important rather than applying this politically and through the ways many people have looked at anarchism throughout history. And so a good way to summarize that is something called the Central Anarchist Insight by community psychologist Seymour Saracen. And that central anarchist insight is that state power should be viewed suspiciously because the centralized state inhibits both individual autonomy and psychological sense of community. From an anarchist perspective, law's short and long-term gains simultaneously create a greater dependency on legal authorities, reducing the ability to work together to solve problems and resolve conflicts. The anarchist emphasis on maximizing individual autonomy within a mutually supportive community has direct relevance to calls by psychologists for a better balance between autonomy and psychological sense of community, agency, and communion. Equity, equality, emancipation, male and female modes of moral judgment. These are just different things that are mentioned, and he lists a bunch of different researchers with all expressing these interests, right? They all express the idea like we want to have a balance between these things. Well, how can we create that balance? Well, maybe this is an insight that can help us. And so let's talk about this, right? Stephanie just mentioned it. Oh, well, you want freedom? I mean, freedom is dangerous, right? Well, you have a quote from like one of the founding fathers of America who says he prefers dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery, Benjamin Franklin. What does that mean? Dangerous freedom. He prefers it over peaceful slavery. Well, we talked about before how it can be quite comfortable to be an order follower, quite comfortable to accept our position, or comfortable not to face reality, or comfortable to accept our own slavery because, we're being provided for, like the slave on the plantation. But it's not our greatest potential, because our greatest potential is that we can be free and outside the plantation as a whole. But if we're not taught and aspire to be, and we're not empowered to be, then we'll never be there. And so, what is this myth of lawlessness? Quote, inaccurate or superficial assumptions about human nature also enhance system legitimacy. According to Tapp, the myth of humankind's lawlessness ignores the fact that the search for rules and rule dependency appears early in human life and is visible across all activity from games to government and language to law. Right? This idea of rules versus rulers, as Leslie mentioned, right? Or natural law versus man's law, as we mentioned before. In essence, she added, no community is truly lawless, and adherence to the myth perpetuates a law and order mentality. Tapp also pointed to the legality myth, with its crippling assumption that legality and its correlates of justice, obligation, and responsibility reside only in the law. If this assumption continues, then the emergence of an authoritarian repressive law is more likely, right? Something is right because it's written on a piece of paper, because an authority says so. It's like what Stephanie mentioned before. It's like, I want to allow people to be free, but I have to be careful with that language. Because is it me who says, oh, well, you're allowed to be free because I said that you're allowed? That's what makes you allowed? No. It's because I'm starting to understand by your own autonomy, given to you by nature, not given to you by me, you are allowed to live your own life. And so, calling for more attention to the psychology of law rather than merely the use of psychology in law, Haney suggested that psychology may be used to help explain the very origins and existence of law. It may attempt to answer why, how, and under what circumstances law comes into being. Here it would address the question of why people need law or feel that they do, primarily by examining the psychological functions laws serve. Inevitably, the belief that people behave justly and responsibly only because the law requires it lowers our expectations for our own actions as well as those others. Those people who do act on their own conscience, who are following this higher law that's beyond man, that's beyond government, as is every revolution attempt in history that has happened dozens and dozens of times. We have to ask, why? Why is that taking place? And would you disobey the law if it went against your own conscience, right? How far are you willing to follow your own conscience, or are you willing to push that down and say, man, well, I should not follow my conscience, not do what is right, instead just do what I'm told, or do it because everybody else is doing it because there's pressures, right? I mean, we have to ask ourselves, it's a very pressing question, and we come to this again and again throughout history and in medicine as well. Are we going to do what's best, or are we not? And so there's the status quo mind. He says, although the system creates people whose minds work to preserve the status quo at all costs, the sensitivity to injustice can be increased by providing social support for its acknowledgement and viable options for its remedy. We may not have consensus about ultimate goals. We may not yet understand how and where to institutionalize alternative dispute resolution techniques in modern societies lacking common values and cultural understandings, or what to do when common sense notions of justice and fairness are distorted by cultural myths, or which socio-political and community changes will best counter the isolation that leads to derogation of outsiders. But despite all that we do not know, we do know a great deal about psychological processes that lead to oppression. And we covered, a bunch of different books before about, this idea of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and then looking at the personality traits just for some examples. He says, using this knowledge, it is time to challenge the common sense through which we interpret the world and demonstrate that alternative arrangements are both imaginable and reachable. Different ways of doing things, different systems that we have not yet tried. Because anarchism, you can say, is without a system, but it's also considered a type of system, right? Which is why it's a whole political theory and people make a whole bunch of different systems out of it. But it is certainly unique in the fact that it does claim to not be one among the other systems. Because there's something that makes it very different from these other systems. There is this lack of a centralized authority, a lack of dependence on some individual or select few individuals. There's a much greater emphasis on individual autonomy, which, again, we see as a parallel to what we want perhaps in health. And so there's the anarchist principle. The past president of the American Psychology Law Society recently acknowledged that he is not sure that the field of psychology and law is going anywhere, and that to a great extent, psychologists of law still have blinders on when they look at law and the legal system. Although Melton did not propose anarchy as a solution, a critical anarchist perspective can be a valuable component of efforts to understand the subjective experience of law. Goodman pointed out what he called the anarchist principle, which holds that valuable behavior occurs only by the free and direct response of individuals or voluntary groups to the conditions presented by the historical environment, and that it's a social psychological hypothesis with obvious political implications. So Goodman also had a lot of work on psychology on this end as well, and again, emphasizing voluntary relationships. We talked about this idea before, voluntarism. We'll dive deeper into what that means, but voluntarism is an idea that is basically anarchism, a field of anarchism, but it's being used as a new term, a term that helps people understand what is it really about. It's about voluntary interactions because people are finding out, yeah, this word anarchy is associated with chaos, it's associated with rebels, whether they do it for any moral reason or not. It's being used by all sorts of people. Maybe they're communists or socialists and they want to create a certain type of government. That's not the same thing as letting people live their own life and saying, choose how to live your own life voluntarily and leave me alone. And as long as I leave you alone too, then it's reciprocal and we follow the golden rule. It's rather quite different. And so that term voluntarism has been sparked out of that. So psychology, ideology, and the commons. So Maslow, and if you look at Maslow, he talks about this too. He approved of the anarchist emphasis on an ecological relationship with nature. Its stress on decentralization, local autonomy, and personal responsibility, and its mistrust of force, large organizations, and large accumulations of power. Deploring the fact that, quote, most intellectuals know little or nothing about philosophical anarchism. Philosophical anarchism, psychological anarchism. This is directly from Maslow. He went on to identify anarchy as the level of organization in politics and economics for those who have transcended self-actualization. Some very powerful words. A lot of people know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but yet they do not know that he said these things. He says, in the farther reaches of human nature, Maslow discussed the idea of a decentralized and anarchic society, emphasizing local autonomy, personal responsibility, and a mistrust of large organizations. He believed that a society could be voluntary, productive, and ethical. Quote, many anthropologists have contended that the small egalitarian anarchy is the oldest type of polity and one which has characterized most of human history. And he gives references to several. Some of the leading anthropologists, like Matt Gaber, I think is his name, also talks about this very deeply. You can find interviews with him online back in the day where he talks about this idea of like, well, yeah, it's not really what you think anarchy is. And it's a rather very unique perspective. And these people are definitely not trying to create chaos in the world. They're trying to better understand themselves and the world at large to find out what is the best way we can go about in changing society. Maybe we need to learn how to let things go more rather than trying to get a grasp on everything and trying to control everything. That might be part of the problem here. So, in contrast to the popular Hobbesian tone of much current thought, which, if you're not familiar with Thomas Hobbes, it's the idea that the state of nature is by nature like chaotic, like people cannot get along voluntarily. There's just going to be chaos if you let people be free. Barclay noted that clearly the anthropological record does not support Hobbes in any way. Stateless societies seem less violent and brutish than those with the state. Refusing to consider anarchist perspectives and failing to question our own basic assumptions may ultimately lead to tragedies that could otherwise be avoided. Tragedies such as democide, the top cause of unnatural death. There's some powerful quotes here talking about what we do with ideology, imposing on others, and then seeing what is common among us. Most people live voluntarily right now, but they only create an exception when, right? When it comes to this authority and the government that they create, perhaps, right? They say, well, this needs to be imposed on everyone for the greater good, for the common good. And they make all sorts of justifications, such as from a Hobbesian point of view or a certain type of ideology that justifies them in doing so. And so some people may also talk about how this is utopian. Well, Dennis Fox also talks about this. Quote, utopian thought in general and anarchist thought in particular could be dismissed quite easily were it not for two factors. For one thing, as Moos and Brownstein pointed out, utopian solutions are now a necessity rather than a luxury. For another, traditional anarchist accounts of human motives in social organization happen to mesh surprisingly well with recent psychological theory and with the data at hand. As Oscar Wilde stated, is this utopian? A map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country sets sail. Progress, he says, is the realization of utopias. And I'll remind you again that the abolitionists in America who wanted to end slavery were seen as utopian for wanting to do so, despite wanting to simply elevate their fellow man to a higher moral conscience, to stand on their principles, right? And so it was a necessity to them, not necessarily a luxury, like, oh yeah, it's better and it seems like it's impossible to reach. No, it's a necessity. Like we have to. We understand we own ourselves. We understand these are individuals who own their own lives. We have to stand on that. It's a necessity. And so I think we're coming to that understanding as we find out this repeat of history and as things are getting more dangerous with technology and medicine, that we need to let individuals live their own life and have autonomy over their own life and their own choices. And if we cannot respect that basic fundamental need, a lot of other things will start to fall apart. And here, I actually decided to include some information from Benjamin Rush and what he wrote, Education Proper in a Republic. Right, so again, this is one of the American founding fathers and the father of American psychiatry. Notice the words that he uses here, okay? And I want you to bear in mind, this is what a lot of people believe. And maybe it's not what a lot of people believe, but they haven't necessarily investigated their own beliefs, right? And so look at this. Let our pupil be taught that he does not belong to himself, but that he is a public property. Let him be taught to love his family, but let him be taught at the same time that he must forsake and even forget them when the welfare of his country requires it. In the education of youth, let the authority of our masters be as absolute as possible. By this mode of education, we prepare our youth for this subordination of laws and thereby qualify them for becoming good citizens for the republic, right? So creating a justification for this ideology. Notice he says, convert men into republican machines. Takes the child as soon as they can speak, checks his natural independence and passions, makes him subordinate to superior age, to the laws of the state, to town and different institutions. I mean, he's saying it in his own words here, this idea of, no matter what you do, no matter what you believe, you have to obey the government and the authorities. It is necessary, and this is what's needed for our education system. We talked about before the education system as being one of the prime factors that gets people into this belief system of following authority rather than morality. Just as a reminder, that is the father of American psychiatry, at least that's the title that we give him. So I think that's quite telling for what we're talking about. Now, we mentioned this individual before, Seymour Saracen, as a psychologist. He actually coined the term community psychology. And so this helps us understand a solution that is based in the principles of philosophical or psychological anarchism and not based in, chaos and wanting to do more harm to this world, but rather how do we treat people and how do we treat society as a whole? So he says the central state in its governmental apparatus, by its very nature and dynamics, inevitably becomes a force alien to the interests of its people. And the stronger the state becomes, the more it enslaves people in the sense that they are required, they are forced to do things they do not want to do, i.e., there is adulution and personal autonomy. The rhetoric of the state is one thing, its actual operations are something else again. The more powerful the state becomes, the more its people look to it as the fount of initiative and succor. The more is the psychological sense of community diluted. That is to say, the more the lives of people are a consequence of decisions made in the castle, the more they are robbed of those communal bonds and responsibility upon which the sense of rootedness is built. So Saracen emphasizes a focus on prevention rather than being reactive. He explores the complex relationship between scientific inquiry and state influence, emphasizing the potential loss of autonomy for even scientists, not just the general public. He's saying all the way around here, as long as you have the state in control of medicine and people are giving away their autonomy to this, status mentality, you're not going to have a truly healing model, and it's going to cause all sorts of problems. And I love, by the way, people like Saracen or Young are explaining these concepts. I think they're all quite parallel to each other, and you can let us know what you think. But, when Young talks about this idea of state slavery and state doctrine, and he's talking about pretty much, I would say, the same exact thing that Saracen is saying here, it's very interesting to see. And here's more from him. He critiques the evidence-based practice movement, arguing it often overlooks the socio-political context and power dynamics involved in community interventions. Saracen advocates for an anarchist approach, encouraging community psychologists to question and challenge established power structures and assumptions within their field. He highlights the importance of considering historical, cultural, and social factors in psychological research and practice, critiquing the often asocial and ahistoric nature of American psychology. In his work, The Creation of Settings in the Future Societies, he explores how settings like schools and communities are created and maintained, how it should not just be about achievement, and how they can be designed to promote human well-being, critical thinking, and social responsibility. So let's say you're somebody into education, or you're delving deeper into the psychology, boom, there's a solution by Saracen who's talking about how we can create a setting in a future mode of education that will support these aimed goals. And there's many people who share solutions that are voluntary, done without violence, without creating an authority in man. So what is about that? Maybe those solutions have not yet been implemented. Maybe those solutions are not yet known by people. I can guarantee you most people probably don't even know who Seymour Saracen is. But I think it is incredible when you look into his work and you find out, wow, he's got all this information. Right? And that's why we're bringing it to the table and we're revealing it for you guys. So related to what Seymour talked about with community psychology and Dennis Fox regarding critical psychology is the idea of ecopsychology. So you can see there's different fields created to represent this holistic view of the world. Ecopsychology explores the relationship between human beings and the natural world, emphasizing the psychological benefits of connecting with nature and the detrimental effects of environmental degradation on mental health. It challenges the reductionist and mechanistic views of traditional psychology, advocating for more holistic and integrative approaches. We see this type of interconnectedness and autonomy promoted in anarchist thought. Similarly, Alan Watts, known speaker and teacher of Eastern philosophy, details how nature is philosophical anarchism, but the reason that he gives is because of ecology. He says, when you look under the world, you look at the world under the lens of ecology, you start to see this eco-spirituality, which is another field, right? But it all helps us see our relationship with nature, which you can say is often the bulk of my work as well regarding Taoism, right? It's understanding this relationship we have with nature, which some people may call God, and other terms of that nature to see the bigger picture and beyond the mechanistic, beyond the reductionist, bring in that right brain feminine aspect.
Hey, Corey, I just want to add for anybody listening, in case they didn't know, technology is not God.
Right. And so let's connect some of this here, being that we understand these different fields of psychology. Going back now to statism, here we have Jamie Heckert, an academic in sociology, psychology. He says the statist state of mind, so directly talking about it, is characterized by representation over and above direct experience, an attraction to domination and control, and a continual reliance on fear. An other state of mind necessary for and produced by anarchist or anarchistic social relations is characterized by vitality or freedom equality, non-attachment to memory, and love. Such a state of mind, I argue, is cultivated through spiritual practice internally and through free, equal, and loving relations with others. Now again, how often do you see this being described in the lens of anarchy? He says, I have suggested that the state is always also a state of mind characterized by fear, self-centeredness, and attachment to categorization and judgment. In contrast, I have offered fragments of an anarchist psychology, which advocates individual and collective practices which enable a release of this individualism in exchange for connection with others and with one's own intuition. Notice that emphasis on that self, intuition, conscience. Murray Bookchin says the state is not merely a constellation of bureaucratic and coercive institutions, it is also a state of mind, an instilled mentality for ordering reality. Awe and apathy in the face of state power are products of social conditioning that renders this very power possible. In fact, I was actually just talking with Stephanie before about Thomas Paine, one of the American founding fathers and revolutionaries, who was really standing firm on the principles, who really, his writings led up to the Declaration of Independence in America, of saying, hey, we're not beholden to the monarchy. And he really stood on his principles that he even found himself at odds with other founding fathers. And he observed, among others, like Edmund Burke, that there was Massachusetts, this one state that didn't have a government for many years, and that it was perfectly fine. Like, nobody really thought of it as anything, but there was order. Like, people took care of their own business and people protected each other, and it seemed like everything was fine. And Edmund Burke even said, like, it kind of throws everything on its head. And there was other observations similar to this by Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson saying the same thing. So you can see this among several writers. But it seems quite interesting, because if people didn't really think anything of it until somebody started to mistrust the system that they currently lived in, and mistrust others, and start to say, well, we need to create a government, it seems like people would have just went on with their lives. So maybe there's an indoctrination that happens. Maybe there is this programming within us that says we have to create this system that maybe we don't need to create at all. And it's the same thing with slavery. We talked about, it's like we have to create this system because it's necessary and it's essential. Maybe it's not necessary at all. Now, can we make that connection? Can we say this is one the same? We can look at history. We can look at anthropology, as we mentioned, and we might see a lot of coincidences, but I'll have you think for yourself on that. And so the task of community psychology, here we have another psychologist. He says, the insights of anarchism, I posit, are the knowledges derived from the fragments of anarchism that already exist in communities. So he says there's already anarchy within society, within the world. The task of community psychologists concerned with the insights of anarchism is to work with people to communicate, strengthen, and make connections between these different fragments. I offer two examples of how the insights of anarchism can be engaged, namely through a community garden initiative and debates among activists on the role of the state. I find this incredible since, of course, I'm in Florida and actually doing a community garden initiative, and also Jim Gale, who has 50 acres in Florida, is doing the same thing, and it's helping people see that we can become free and self-sustainable and get together with our community. So it's already doing this. And it's incredible because most people know deep down inside that's the healthy, right thing to do. But yet a lot of people don't do it, or they say it's too much work, or they don't know how, and the systems aren't really helping them do that. And that's why permaculture exists, to show how easy it is, as opposed to just regular gardening. And so it's interesting because, we have all these different forms of government, and then we have anarchy, we have voluntarism, these new ideas, just like permaculture, that come in to kind of challenge everything, the way we've been doing things, and say, wait, we just want to fulfill what lives inside of you. Like voluntary relationships, most people live by in their everyday life. They only give an exception to it in politics, like I mentioned before. So that means it already exists within most people in their communities. So it's not that controversial for us to just talk about anarchy as we are right now in this seminar, if you understand it from that position. If you understand it from the position of self-empowerment and increasing the consciousness of these communities and people within them.
Corey, I would like to say, again, this community psychology and the insights of anarchism around this principle reminds me yet again of this perceived dual nature of masculine qualities, principles, and feminine qualities and principles. And in terms of the community, as you're saying, this anarchy is already occurring by them looking at the gaps in the system and filling the gaps that need to be filled within the community. To me, that reminds me of the actual purpose of the feminine principle. So in the Bible, Eve was created as man's helpmate, and she also provides Adam a holistic feedback loop. So he just doesn't name and identify without anyone mirroring what he's doing and saying, well, hold on, you might have missed this person over here in your focus, right? So this reminds me again of this, the concept of the outlier, or the concept of the black sheep of the family, or the concept of the feminine principle, is that the outlier perspective, that which is different, that provides feedback to the perceived authority, seems to be always a threat, when in reality, it should be coupled and they should be in a right relationship where the authority, the authorship, the person in charge, let's say the masculine energy, would be accepting to his helpmates' feedback so they can improve the system together. But it seems that that is viciously threatened and under attack because it changes things. So the goal is for these two to understand, these principles to understand that together they evolve more organically and in a healthy fashion. When we resist one or we devalue one principle, one half of our whole will remain in chaos and war. Do you see what I'm saying, though, regarding like even the black sheep of the family? It's all a micro to the macrocosm. It's like the black sheep of the family often is the one who sees things that are dysfunctional within the family dynamic and can be ostracized for their ability to tell the truth and to see what could be improved that the family system doesn't want to shift or change on. So from the micro to the macro, it seems like to me it feels like this is a very obvious issue that we need to learn the tasks and how both of them can work together, and the purpose of them evolving together is how we break through when we fear trust in the collapse of what is. We need to develop the trust that if we let this shift and break down, that we've got what it takes to do this together and it's going to be okay. I think that's where we're blocked, is just we're not working together. We don't understand the principles of these forces and we're blocking it, which is just creating more tension under that vice grip, more warring within and without.
Yeah. Another observation I have is that, we're looking at the community, and that is very important for mental health, right? And the isolation that goes on with a lot of individuals. The social fabric, I think, of our society tends to be very isolative because of the technology that people have, and there needs to be more avenues where people can come together and want to get together. And a community garden is a good example of that, but it needs to inspire them. It needs to bring out their interests. And I think, introducing other ideas among that can be even more powerful. So let's say, a Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever, they have land in front of these buildings that are usually just grasses that could be turned into gardens. There's so much untapped potential within all the different institutions that if they chose to do it, we could see a massive shift happen.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add, in regards to health and community, a cancer cell is one that wants to not be coherent with the other cells in the environment. So most sickness and disease or issues with organs starts with a sensation of, I don't fit in here. I'm different. I'm not being coherent with the rest of my community I'm supposed to be coherent with. But the issue then lies, and the deeper nuance is, can we discern what is healthy so far as our environments? Because we don't want to say be a part of your environment if it's
Right.
not a healthy environment. So how do we learn to trust that process so we can evolve?
Absolutely. Here's a quote from Eric from This is a society which needs to make man fit in a complicated and hierarchically organized system of production with a minimum of friction. It creates the organization man, a man without conscience or conviction, but one who is proud of being a cog, even if it is only a small one in a big and imposing organization. He is not to ask questions, not to think critically, not to have any passionate interest, for this would impede the smooth functioning of the organization. Right, so there are counter interests to this idea of autonomy and freedom, as great as it may sound, and as much as many people may want it deep down inside, there's systems that tend to suppress this individual autonomy for the sake of its own existence. Right? You can't have that business model of keeping people not too sick or not too healthy, but dependent in the middle, without that sense of I'm not free, I'm not in control of my health, and they need that mentality of dependence, that fear, in order for those systems to persist. And so, we're really hitting on it here right now among all different organizations, what's going on here. And he says it directly, without conscience, without conviction. Again, how do order followers, people who suppress their conscience, create all the evil in the world? It's because they really suppress that freedom that really wants to express deep down inside.
And I can say from my own experience as a middle manager that this definitely exists in the dynamics of most agencies. That, they often will put someone in that middle management place to basically keep the worker bees in order, and keep them somewhat satisfied as long as they're not challenging, the dictums of the bosses on top, and if you start to do that, there's resistance. So you can look at your own work environment and kind of see this pattern.
Yeah. Scott, what do you think about this as well? And what about like the school system? You're a school teacher. Of course, we talked about the school system in the past. Would you say in that system it can ha take place as well? Scott?
Yeah, a school is going to be a reflection of the greater society and the mores of the group outside the school, you know, sent in by the parents and families. So yeah, it's going to be very similar.
Hmm.
And it's going to be mutually reinforcing. The school is going to teach and reinforce the mores of the society.
All right. Well, let's talk about it. The predominant institution, Daniel Rhodes, a psychotherapist, says the predominant institution for children in our society is, of course, the school system. So let's go back to it. Let's really reflect now that we've gathered much more information since the last time we talked about it. And then, depending on the child and their family, other institutions may become an important aspect of his or her life. That can include the churches, healthcare settings, such as doctors' offices, public health agencies, just as Leslie mentioned, mental health agencies, etc. When you reflect on how these institutions are established and the agenda that they have as part of their mission, you begin to understand why I had this overwhelming sense that I was being observed at all times. The main purposes of most of these institutions are to institutionalize people. To institutionalize people, there has to be established a system of domination and control, a structural and hierarchical system that becomes hegemonic. And he says perceived dependence on institutions becomes a form of symbiosis.
But this is where we have to be very careful. And this is where we miss the mark, is that then it becomes pathological, or it's the system, that environment space can start to, I guess, become susceptible to entropic thinking and kind of the similarity. We can't rise above the highest one within the institution. So then it puts that ceiling on our evolution and our growth.
Could you expand on that? What do you mean by entropic?
I mean that when we get together and agree on something without room for expansion above and beyond, because we have rules and regulations, it stays same, and it can become like a stinky little pond at some point because we're unable to go up and out to get air, to breathe. Literally, physically, many people, doctors, are stuck in the hospital all day long. But then it's very difficult to break out beyond that which is, let's say, the highest thinker within that establishment. You kind of can't do that. Like, if you want to expand beyond what's being offered, you hit a glass ceiling or resistance. So eventually then I think the spiral starts to kind of work down, or we just kind of teeter around the same spot. I don't know if that makes sense. It's just, I'm trying to say something, I'm visualizing.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And I think it's very important to see here. It's like the institutions are institutionalizing people. Are they really themselves if they have to be schooled, right, into being someone who maybe they're not, and maybe learning things that they don't want to learn? A lot of people learn things that they're like, well, I've got to learn it to get this grade, to do this, and I think it can be very pressuring sometimes. You have other students in that environment. The parents are not present. a lot of influences that happen, the textbooks, what are they teaching? What's the history that they're teaching? Is it really all accurate? I mean, now you have the internet and now people can challenge anything. Now AI can write your own tests. I mean, there's a lot of interesting developments and things that are rapidly shifting that's going to challenge these institutions, but also reinforce some institutions.
Yeah, and I just want to add, Corey, as Scott was saying, in the public setting, it's kind of normalized that, like you said, some people just want to do what they have to do to get the grade. They just want to get the grade to be able to move forward. There's no real critical thinking, no real interest and excitement and curiosity. And if a teacher does bring that to the table, often they're questioned for going against the dominant narrative. The other thing is, if they're learning and they're institutionalized like that, again, it's hard to go beyond that. In fact, I have a friend who was a healthcare provider at a very prestigious American healthcare institution. He had a lot of power, but he actually said to me, they're not letting me go beyond. They're not letting me do what I want to do. So even someone that does have a perceived level of power or authority at some point is still limited within that institutional or educational confines.
Yes, I think we can observe some left brain thinking as well, among the lines of institutionalization. And we'll talk about it here on this slide.
The Panopticon model mentions how the Panopticon related to Taylorism is used to further control minds, including within the school systems. It operates like an inflexible and rigid machine or prison. Referencing Michael Foucault, reductionist scientific model that we have been looking at through the system of the Panopticon also removes us from the natural world, and as noted with the ideas of Descartes, views the natural world as either non-existent or dead. In our effort to escape from aloneness and powerlessness, we are ready to get rid of our individual self, either by submission to new forms of authority or by a compulsive conforming to accepted patterns. This becomes the foundation of the Panopticon, taking advantage of individuals' uncertainty and then selling itself as the only thing certain.
Selling itself as the only thing certain, right? And notice it says submission to new forms of authority, getting rid of our individual self, viewing the natural world as either non-existent or dead. And then the reductionist scientific model, right? This left brain view can actually detach us from the natural world, even though we may say that science is there to help us study and align to the natural world. So quite interesting reflections here. And you can look more into this model and Taylorism for more understanding about this and how it relates to our current school models and how just the design of the classroom and the design of these institutions are based off of this model that promotes this psychology without people recognizing that.
Hey, Corey, I just want to add in, I'm having a moment here where it is incredible to recognize how much information exists that so much of society is unaware of. It's amazing to think that all of the solutions we may already need already exist, but we're not aware of it. We're not seeking the knowledge. We're not looking for the truth. We're too comfortable. So I'm so grateful for you, in this presentation, because look at all of this information.
Yeah.
We'd be operating differently as humanity, I believe, if we had this information.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So maybe there is a manufacturing of consent, right? Through these different systems we create and all these complex institutions and ideologies, there may be even a deliberate model or machinery to creating this specific type of consent and mentality in people. There might be people who are trying to perfect that, right? I mean, in this world in order to create certain conditions. And so here you have Daniel Rhodes, who says, for those who become overtly rebellious, the criminal justice system can become involved and the child can be criminalized. For those who become paranoid and question the system, the mental health institutions become involved and a child can become pathologized. And so then he says the ultimate purpose of institutions, beginning with schools, is to develop an idea that Noam Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. And this manufacturing consent becomes a process of indoctrination. Now, if you don't know, by the way, who Noam Chomsky is he's actually an anarchist very openly, very late in his life, actually still alive. I think he's in his 90s at the moment of me recording this seminar.
He
And
passed away, actually.
oh, did he?
I believe
Wow.
so. Yeah.
Okay, well, rest in peace. In either case, amazing information, though, that definitely lives on. He's a linguist who has a lot of fields of expertise among many different things. But he was always very outspoken about a lot of things going on, and one of his main ideas was this idea of manufacturing consent. How does consent become um, devalued and turned into something where it's like, are you really giving your consent or are you? So this quote continues to say, but to most effectively indoctrinate citizens to make it feel democratic, it has to be a process of indoctrination that seems to be in the best interest of the citizens and an indoctrination that is acceptable. It becomes a self-imposed totalitarianism, as Chomsky has said. And so their system of operation becomes scientific and objective, removing passion or feelings, establishing itself as the truth. Physical structuring of the classroom can contribute to ADHD, he goes on to talk about. And he says the number of preschoolers taking medications for ADHD has increased 300% from 1990 to 1995. Many of the systems contribute to convincing about medication. So, of course, he's talking about a lot of different things that we've talked about. And scientific, objective, removing passion or feelings, again, outdoing that right brain feminine aspect that we find to be rather important moving forward. And again, since we're looking at many different, researchers and philosophies and psychologists, I mean, you're going to come across some nuance, you're going to come across some similarities. So it's very interesting to see what people say. Daniel goes on to say they want to somehow convince us that by monitoring our every move, we are now free. This surveillance somehow becomes freedom. And the concern for this, as Marcuse points out, is that psychologically, the difference between domination and freedom is becoming smaller. But I still believe that our natural reaction is to reject this artificial form of freedom and embrace a freedom that disconnects us from the panopticon and reconnects us to ourselves and those around us. That is why I think the ideas of anarchism are so important to education and psychology. I think that a psychology of anarchism will ultimately be an eco-psychology, he says, where traditional Western psychology and science have worked so hard to remove humanity from the natural world, and with the panopticon actually removing us from our own human nature, a psychology of anarchism and eco-psychology will reconnect us back to ourselves and the natural world. Traditional Western science is what has historically separated us from the natural world and has viewed nature as something to conquer instead of working with. Wow, right? Amazing. Seeing how this is written, and many people may not be aware of this knowledge, like Stephanie said. So, a holistic view on change, you can see this is, he says, and to continue, once upon a time, all psychologies were eco-psychologies. Those who sought to heal the soul took it for granted that human nature is densely embedded in the world we share with animal, vegetable, mineral, and all the unseen powers of the cosmos. Just as all medicine was in times past understood to be holistic, a healing of body, mind, and soul, and did not need to be identified as such, so all psychotherapy was once spontaneously understood to be cosmically connected. What a quote from Theodore Rozak. And Hannah Arendt called the banal uh, Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil as the idea of just doing your duty or obeying orders or obeying the law or just doing business. So again, you see different researchers reaffirming these points. It is when evil is normalized. She shares how most evil is committed by ordinary people, done this way. Ward Churchill calls these individuals little Eichmanns, and that actually is a reference to the Nazis, right, and what happened then. And here's a quote: "Every agency I have worked at as a mental health professional and psychotherapist uses this term client-centered as its mission. The irony is that these agencies are client-centered only if the client is willing to engage in this short-term, solution-focused cognitive behavioral psychotherapy. Psychotherapists now have become heavily monitored to make sure that they are engaging in the only approved form of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy has become only concerned with patching the client up and sending him or her back into the grind, back into the world of producing or consuming." So really covering a bunch of different things here on this slide with different quotes that he's sharing within this article, within this writing. And I found this to be particularly the most powerful quotes from his writings. I mean, goodness gracious, look at that. Hannah Arendt she's actually well respected as a historian, and she's talking about how this idea of obeying orders and obeying the law is this great deal of evil, and just doing your business, and how most evil is created by good people. So really reaffirms the Stanley Milgram experiment and everything else we talked about.
And I'll say, as a psychotherapist working with some insurance companies, through insurance companies and previously with government insurances, that it is monitored in this way of making sure that we are using approved research-based therapeutic models, right? That we are supposed to justify our work and use only those that have been sort of given a gold star by an entity that is an authority right above us, and that it's reduced almost to checkbox forms, where it's very devoid, where any notes are really separate from what's actually what's actually real in the therapy session, to just checking off boxes that are satisfying this entity.
So Theodore Rozak actually is somebody who coined ecopsychology, and one of the few people who I think started that whole field. But it's certainly interesting to see that he's got a very spiritual view on the material world, and I think that's where nature comes into balance with, human beings, you can say, through this perspective.
By the way, I worked with Ward Churchill briefly in Denver,
Really?
Native American Indian movement. Right after 9/11, he called the individuals that worked in the towers little Eichmanns, and that got him fired from the university system.
Hmm.
So he was very direct in his language.
What's Eichmann?
Eichmann is Adolf, or yeah, I think it was Adolf Eichmann, was notorious for being one of the Nazi managers near the top of the hierarchy that coordinated all of the shipments by train to the camps. And then he was kidnapped from Argentina in the 1980s, I believe, because they found out he was hiding out in Argentina, and the Mossad kidnapped him. They took him back to Israel and put him on trial. A little Eichmann then would be, Eichmann basically gave the following: I was just following orders, defense, and that made that defense pretty famous in the Israeli courts. And that's all he had to say. He felt justified that he was just doing his job. So when we say a little Eichmann, we're talking about these people who are order followers along the same pattern, that just follow the orders of authority and feel like no matter what, the morality of the action that they're doing is okay because they are doing their job.
And as we talked about with structures and systems, we also have to bear in mind the language, right? And we talked about this before as well a little bit. Rhodes details how the mere language in psychotherapy has become technocratic, linear. Best practices, quality assurance, accountability, strength, progress. Well, Jung tells us this: the analyst must go on learning endlessly and never forget that each new case brings new problems to light and thus gives rise to the unconscious assumptions that have never before been constellated. And from Slater, a psychotherapist, requirements for credentials are designed not to create excellence, but merely to limit membership and keep prices up. In the fields that I know best, university teaching and psychotherapy, the kind of training that leads to proper credentials is often actually detrimental, at best irrelevant. There are equal numbers of excellent therapists, for example, among the credentialed and uncredentialed, and equal number of dangerous incompetents. So that really shatters the authority of this practice, doesn't it? To just say, well, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Perhaps we have to look at the context, right? What are they doing? What's the actions that they are partaking?
What is the mindset of the clinician towards the client, you know? And is it one of authority and I know better? You know, is it that I'm here just to do what my, the insurance company's telling me I should be doing? There can be a lot of limitations. And the quality of a psychotherapist also is very much dependent on the degree of that therapist's own inner work, right?
Right.
So you can't always judge that on the surface.
Leslie, I just want to add, coming from like a patient perspective, again, if we just had a narrative shift or a languaging shift of we're in this together, you have as much responsibility as I do, and I'm going to give my expertise, but this is a team effort. Like if we just really, really changed that languaging and initiated every therapeutic
Wow.
relationship with those languages, I, I don't know. I would love to see the repercussions of that.
Yes. And I think that's also where questions come handy because some of that language could be used also against the client. Say, oh, I'm on your side while they're doing all sorts of things to them. So it might be more important to ask questions if you're going to continue that relationship so you can make sure that the person who you're working with is really somebody that, is in tune with themselves as well.
I was just speaking about this with somebody yesterday who is a physician.
Mm,
And you're right. Obviously, there are some people who are incapable and they need that guidance in a way that can't maybe be totally equal based off of their physical or mental condition. But I would assume that a large proportion of people can hold that self responsibility along with the
true.
expertise of the professional.
Right. And I feel like we shouldn't probably degrade people of their potential. Say, oh, well, they'll never be able to do that. Because then, we're really giving up on them. We can't really do that if we want them to heal.
I actually have to bring this up. This is a real world example that just happened yesterday. I am friends online with a woman who is a quadriplegic, and she is incredibly an empowering spirit, the way she travels and she shares her story online. And she often talks about, she said, look, I don't even consider myself a victim, and I'm a quadriplegic. And it's really, bringing to the forefront of who really actually, what is a victim? Who actually is the victim? And are we propping up or pedestalizing people who just need some love and some self-work as victims and forgetting about the people who are quadriplegic navigating the world that's very inaccessible? And they're even saying, I don't want to be seen as a victim. So when you have people who can be true victims, who have the ability to say, I don't want to hold that title, then why does it even exist?
Good point. And so, to expand on this, well, we talked about this idea of anarchy, relating it to psychotherapy. He calls it, Daniel Rhodes, right up the bat, anarchist psychotherapy. That this does not mean, he says, that there is an adopting of specific techniques and styles or specific therapeutic intervention or even an anarchist political agenda. It is about critical thinking and intellectual questioning. It is about psychotherapy not being solely based on the social sciences and behavioral psychology. It is based on ecopsychology and its rejection of the Western scientific model being the only model to be used. June Singer, an analytical psychologist, says analytical psychology casts its lot with the champions of individual freedom and offers another source of guidance than that of the political or psychological despot. However, benevolent that person may be. Foucault says the problem is not changing people's consciousness or what's in their heads, but the political, economic, institutional regime of the production of truth. Institutions do not rely on the physical structure to control and dominate. It relies on the internal mental component of those in the institutions to control and dominate themselves in the name of the institutions. As Fromm notes, authority does not have to be a person or institution which says you have to do this or you have not allowed to do that. While this kind of authority may be called external authority, authority can appear as internal authority under the name of duty, conscience, or super-ego. This is where we can say there's a nuance to the conscience, where we are turning on ourselves. And you can say it's relatively just simply statism, right, which is overtaking the conscience and taking its place. And so let's delve deeper into that, because there's this internal and external authority. Well, there's also this idea of the anonymous authority. So Eric Fromm talks about this. He says, anonymous authority is more effective than overt authority, since one never suspects that there is any order which one is expected to follow. In external authority, it is clear that there is an order and who gives it. One can fight against the authority, and in this fight, personal independence and moral courage can develop. But whereas in internalized authority, the command through an internal one remains visible, in anonymous authority, both command and commander have become invisible. The authoritarian systems cannot do away with the basic conditions that make for the quest for freedom. Neither can they exterminate the quest for freedom that springs from these conditions. Man, the more he gains freedom in the sense of emerging from the original oneness of man and nature, and the more he becomes an individual, has no choice but to unite himself with the world in the spontaneity of love and productive work, or else to seek a kind of security by such ties with the world as destroy his freedom and the integrity of his individual self. Amazing, profound words, I would say, regarding the nature of the individual looking at themselves in relation to the world. Sounds like this, like I said, came right from Carl Jung's mouth. And with some of these words, I mean, my goodness. I also find it quite interesting to see the pattern here of the use of the word spontaneity, since there's this idea in a lot of the capitalist thought and people who are in economics who want freedom away from the government, about this idea of a spontaneous order that emerges when people are left to voluntarily trade with each other. And also in Taoism, with this idea that nature spontaneously grows of itself, like your heart always beats and your lungs always breathe, and that things kind of just grow on their own if you let them be. So we tend to see that too, I think, as a pattern among some of these researchers.
You can even think about people do have spontaneous healings. And usually it's an alignment of an inner and outer environment in lieu of love and unity. I mean, it's the same principles over and over again. If we can just learn to tap in and remember who we are as a soul and who, what we're doing here together, I have full trust and faith that we can do this much better.
Yeah. Isn't it fascinating? There's so many perspectives upon this. I mean, how many ways, how many words do we have to create to represent the same idea? That's what's incredible about it. And that's why, anarchism, for those of you who come to this presentation and learn about these ideas, don't get stuck on the word, don't get emotionally reactive to it. If you see the bigger picture of what we're talking about, it's not that, it's not this, it's much more than that, right? It's looking more at, what are all these things, all these patterns that consist through all these different terms. What are people really looking for at the end of the day? It's like trying to get really down to that essence of life that I think we're trying to all find within our lives. And so what is the essence of the state? Go ahead, Stephanie. You can say something.
I was just going to say, if maybe we could clarify what we were talking about earlier, I think off camera, about this spectrum of anarchism, where we have these words. I think that there's just a lot of negative connotation and a lot of misunderstandings around the word anarchism, and they can be immediately turned off instead of really understanding this relationship between anarchism and voluntarism. And if you see that, if you just simply look at that as a spectrum, two ends of a spectrum that are both accurate spirit and must be displayed depending on the environmental circumstance. So another concept I love is faith and works, which you'll find in the Bible, right? Or, the feminine, masculine, and the art of being and intuiting and being still and doing and knowing when to do what. It seems to me that a lot of the major issues we have, not only within the micro, but on the macro, are that we're out of order. Is that we're overdoing when we should be being and reorienting, or we're being still and passive when actually we should be acting. So I just want it for our audience to, have that broader understanding of, I kind of see it as anarchism can happen when somebody needs to stand up against something that's wrong. And there are times where we have to do that. You can't just lay passive. But the other end of the spectrum is we do things voluntary together. We have trust that we're doing the right thing together, right? So it depends on what's coming at us, out of us personally, or from the environment to decide kind of where are we lying on this spectrum. And of course, the balance would be in the middle between
Right.
having to rebel per se and having to just be still and more, voluntary and passive. It's kind of understanding when to do what in what environments in the right order, if that makes any sense.
And this, of
Great.
course, would require building self-trust, right? And require a commitment to gaining knowledge and developing one's skills. It's really a potential for a much greater satisfaction in your work, and feeling very vital and purposeful in your calling. When we come from this mindset of, I have the freedom to and the responsibility, right? I have the freedom to help an individual and the responsibility to do it wisely. And that this comes from my, own doings rather than just following directions, right? And that responsibility will ultimately lead to us working together more because not one person has the all end all be all answer. Okay, so there's a great
Right.
possibility for growth, expansion, collaboration, community, and more individualized healing, that will really help anyone who's in the medical system if we can find a way of incorporating these concepts.
Leslie, I love what you just said. To me, again, I see that as a spectrum. We have to broaden the nuances now because we're so damaged with our assumptions of certain words. Is the idea of freedom and responsibility. You cannot have one without the other. And that's for our audience to understand. When we're talking about anarchism, we're also talking about voluntarism on the same opposite side of the
Right.
same coin. Freedom and responsibility go together. They are a couple. So when we say freedom, we're not talking about hedonistic culture and just doing whatever you want and labeling yourself whatever animal or gender or whatever you want. With freedom comes great responsibility. It comes
Wow.
maturity. So just to be clear, when we say freedom, it's not, do whatever you want. That's not what we're saying. It's a
Wow.
maturing and holding great responsibility to steward that freedom in the best way for all of us. That's how I see it.
Amazing. I love
And
how you break that down.
that relates back to the original definition of anarchy. It means literally no rulers. It doesn't mean no rules. And so what Stephanie was saying basically is that there is a way that we can put order and rules into our interactions and fairness and trust um, without having an authority imposed upon us to do that.
Mhm. One thing I will say is that that simple little demonstration you gave, Stephanie, of like voluntarism on one end and anarchism on the other end could be quite powerful because you could even replace that word voluntarism with natural law, right? As like another guiding principle. I think this is why people create such a system to help themselves, like Scott said, attain rules for themselves to further say this is where I'm going to ground my morality and my actions. It's got to be in something, right? So that's what they use to attune themselves. Quite incredible when you can see things from that perspective. It totally throws us off track because usually we think, oh, well, there's anarchy in this end and government on that end. But it's like, no, wait, there's anarchy, and then there's voluntarism. It's like, right? And usually they're associated as one and the same, but they can be perceived differently. And I think you hit it on the nail.
To me, this process of what I call integrating opposites has really been a profound template for me to start to embody more of what I call holistic intelligence, is to really be operating from your perceived duality within you. Right. So, again, what we want to do is if we want to conquer war, we have to first conquer the war within ourselves. Everybody has to do that. You have to see where you're in dual nature within yourself, and you can very easily see that through the way our brain is orchestrated. We have technically we do have a dual nature that's inherent within us, but for me, I feel human evolution and potential arises when we address that duality within ourselves and learn not just our proclivities, but learn how to integrate our perceived opposite, or that which we don't necessarily like or prefer. If we can start to integrate why we don't like it or prefer it and start to look at it more broadly, to me, what happened is then I started to kind of be able to not see so black and white or so binary with words or concepts or people. And I'd be able to say, this is what I feel, but like, what is the opposite of that? And then let me see if maybe I'm not looking at it correctly, or I have a bias in the one way I'm trying to define this. So again, obviously, it's hard to read language that way,
Right.
but then look at voluntarism and anarchism. It's a good way to take a word that a lot of people misunderstand and integrate a very heart opening, expansive way for people to understand the concept.
Great. I actually, just to back up that point on opposites, I have a whole philosophy regarding that for anybody who's interested. But yeah, this idea. So let's talk more about this, the essence of the state. Since we're talking about the essence of, life itself too, we're looking at this opposite within itself. You have this system that claims the authority of nature or God or that higher truth, perhaps within your own life. And then, you have on this other end, this one form of allegiance that you have to God and truth. So it's like, which one do you follow? Which one do you truly stand allegiance to? Well, Jamie Heckert and Felix also talk about this overcoding, that operation that constitutes the essence of the state, which involves lumping life's infinite diversity into categories and then judging in terms of those categories, thus reinforcing the appearance of authority inherent in the categories themselves. So just like Stephanie was saying, unable to see the opposites and rather just lumping ourselves into these different judgments. Heckert says when a person is attached to their representations, thought projections onto reality, they no longer relate directly to reality. They relate instead to the authority of their thoughts. In Eastern philosophy, they'll often talk about how you're so stuck in your mind and full of attachments, and you need to free yourself from that, and that is true freedom. So it can very much relate here. The survival of the state as institution both encourages and depends upon micro-level acts of rigid characterization and judgment. Such rigidity obscures details from vision, whether this is the local detailed knowledge missed by big-picture statecraft or compassion for oneself and other living beings missed through a focus on instrumental self-importance. And we might even see, right, this idea of the ego of non-ego, people who claim that they're super virtuous and doing everything that we're saying and just passing off saying, yeah, I know that. I do it all the time, and it's like, what's going on here, right? Because there can be that ego and that rigidity into thinking that you're doing something so great, even if it is something that perhaps is great in many ways. Does that still excuse you falling into that rigid pattern? And it could also open doorways to potential things you might need to be looking at.
Mm-hmm. Corey, that reminds me a little bit of this perceived like duality between the specialist and the generalist. And I've heard many people lately say that we're moving towards a generalist society, to have that kind of more holistic intelligence away from that specialized thinking. And for me, again, I can see how both are useful at different times. If I need a surgery, I want my surgeon to be very skilled to so I can survive in whatever it is that he's operating on. But if a surgeon is always doing surgery in the room, focused on very detail-oriented things, he can, and he does, as a specialist, start to devalue the generalist. There literally is this battle a lot between like the primary care physician and the surgeons or specialists. You know, one thinks the other one is not useful. So again, it's just this understanding that actually they're both relevant, but beware that if you're a generalist and you're judging the specialist or the surgeon, there may be something within you need to integrate. And in terms of the surgeon or the specialist or the highly, the professional who's very detail oriented, he might be missing on things that are very valuable from the generalist perspective.
Amazing. Well, guys, we've reached the end of part 5 of Health Revealed, our great seminar talking about all these different ideas and solutions. I hope you're excited like I am to learn about the different things that are out there, because I certainly did not hear about any of this information myself until I started to dig deep into it. I was like, wow, there's so many solutions and worldviews and perspectives on things that we deal with on a common day-to-day basis regarding our health and politics. So thank you very much for having an open mind. Be sure to share it with other people. healthrevealed.org. Anybody who's a patient, practitioner, we want to hear your story, your resources. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Soma, anarchist therapy, we are in periods of a dictatorship. And I fight against the dictator. I was arrested 12 times and tortured with violence because I spoke, I wrote against the power. Some are more interested in political actions, though they come to make a life in political ways. The others, no, they don't want to work in political ways, but they organize his life in an anarchist way to be health. The interest is the health. After, when you are yourself, you are health. I work with many anarchists that have the ideas of anarchism, have the project of anarchism for a society, but live as a prisoner, live an incomplete life. The theoretical anarchists, they want to go to the street, to the square, and scream against the powers, but don't do nothing. I think for change the society, you must change the persons.
Do you believe that morality, right and wrong, apply the same to people with badges as to people without? If it's bad for me to do it, it's bad for the police to do
I
it.
think it's all about ethics.
Uh-huh.
As simple as that.
And
Whatever is good for me should be good for you. Whatever is
right.
wrong for me should be wrong for you, and we should all be judged by the same.
I agree completely. When it comes to government, would it even be government if it doesn't have special rights and powers? If it can only do what I can do and what you can do, is it even government anymore?
Can you rephrase that again, please?
Basically, if you have a government, but it only has the rights I have and you have, it only...
If we're equals.
Yeah, if we're all equal, is it even government anymore?
The thing is that that's a perfect scenario, which unfortunately is not happening, right? But if there was such scenario in which we were equals, we would not need government.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you prefer, I gather.
That would be the perfect scenario.
Uh-huh.
Freedom.
Is there any... Oh, are we out of time? Are we at 15 minutes?
Yeah, let me check.
4 minutes. 4 minutes. I don't want to... Oh, okay, cool. I don't want to conscript him any longer than he volunteered for. Can you name anything that you want government to do that you don't have the right to do yourself? Not the ability. You might not have the resources or the ability, but is there anything you want it to do that would be wrong if you did it?
Ooh, that's a good question. Can I come back to you tomorrow about that?
You may. You absolutely may. Or next year.
Honestly,
we'll be back.
I don't have an answer to that, to be very honest with you. But I do repeat the fact of freedom and equal opportunities for everybody.
Mhm.
I think it's very sad to see how the system is using. That's not calling administration. Is they're using the money for their own benefits, for political issues, to support or finance campaigns. I mean, political campaigns, and you go around town and you see kids asking for money in the street, and you go to a hospital, you see people that don't have money to buy, I don't know, aspirin or something like that. So I think it's all about having a fair world for everybody. That's what I mean. That's what I would ask to anybody who had the power to do something about it.
That's what we all want here. That's why we come to this event, because that's the world we want to see.
But please, then I'll come to if you're going to talk about it, I'll join you guys.
Okay.
If I'm allowed.